I am Nolan Barrett, 67 years old, and Easter dinner was supposed to be a quiet affair. Instead, it ended with my daughter-in-law hurling a heavy crystal wine glass directly at my face because I refused to let her parents move into my home. As the glass shattered against my forehead and blood spilled onto the mahogany dining table I had built with my late wife, my son stood up and yelled that I was being selfish. I did not yell back. I simply wiped the blood from my eyes, smiled a very cold smile, and drove myself to the emergency room. From a hospital bed while getting 8 stitches, I sent a text message to my lawyer. Phase 1 is complete. Before I dive into the rest of this story, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to teach an entitled family member a lesson they will never forget. As a retired structural engineer, I spent my entire career understanding how things are built. I know how to calculate the exact amount of pressure a foundation can take before it cracks. I know how to identify load-bearing walls, and I know that when a core pillar rots from the inside out, the entire structure is compromised. For 40 years, I believed my family was built on a solid foundation. My late wife Evelyn and I designed our home in the suburbs from the ground up. It was a sprawling, beautiful property paid off decades ago, filled with light oak wood and memories. We raised our son Colin in that house. I taught him how to ride a bike in the driveway. I helped him with his math homework at the kitchen island. I believed I was raising a man of integrity, a man who understood the value of hard work and respect. But Evelyn passed away 3 years ago from a brutal battle with cancer, and the silence she left behind in the house revealed the cracks in the foundation I had ignored for too long. Colin had married Megan 2 years prior to Evelyn's passing. Megan was aggressively ambitious, a woman who measured human worth strictly by square footage and bank account balances. I tolerated her because a father wants his son to be happy. But the tension had been smoldering beneath the surface for months. That Easter Sunday, the air in my dining room was thick with an unspoken agenda. Colin and Megan had arrived an hour late, bringing along Megan's parents, Gideon and Sylvia. They were uninvited, but they marched into my home as if they held the deed. Gideon, a loud, boorish man with a history of failed businesses, immediately began critiquing the layout of my living room. He complained that the open floor plan was poorly utilized, gesturing widely with his drink, acting as if my home was a model unit, waiting for his redesign. Sylvia ran her fingers over the crown molding. Evelyn had painstakingly chosen, loudly noting that the dust up there must be impossible to reach for an old man living alone. Every word was a calculated insult, a tiny hammer chipping away at my boundaries. I sat at the head of the table carving the roast, watching my son. Colin sat there swirling his red wine, his eyes glued to his plate. He said nothing. He did not defend his childhood home. He did not defend his mother's memory. He simply let his in-laws disrespect the sanctuary I had built. In that moment, watching his cowardly silence, I realized the boy I raised was gone. The dinner progressed with a suffocating awkwardness until Megan finally steered the conversation to her true objective. She began lamenting about the terrible state of the real estate market. She talked about how cramped their expensive rented apartment was and how Gideon and Sylvia's condo association fees were becoming unmanageable. The complaints were a rehearsed symphony. Then she dropped her fork, folded her hands, and looked at me with an entitlement that made my blood run cold. Nolan, she said, using my first name with a sharp, commanding edge. Since Evelyn passed, you have 2 massive empty bedrooms on the 2nd floor. It makes perfect sense for my parents to move in here. We can consolidate our living situations. It will be better for everyone. It was not a request. It was an eviction notice for my peace and privacy. She was officially laying claim to my home, assuming that because I was a grieving widower, I was weak enough to be conquered. I stopped chewing. I placed my knife and fork precisely on the edges of my porcelain plate. I looked at Gideon, who was already nodding, as if the deal was struck. And then I looked at my son. Colin was staring at the tablecloth, absolutely paralyzed by his wife's audacity, yet entirely complicit in her greed. I let the silence stretch for 10 agonizing seconds. I wanted them to feel the weight of their own arrogance. Then I looked directly into Megan's eyes and delivered a single uncompromising word. No. The word dropped onto the dining table like an anvil. Megan blinked rapidly, her fake smile faltering, her brain struggling to process the rejection. "What do you mean, no?" she asked, her voice rising in pitch. I kept my posture perfectly straight, my hands resting on the table. "I mean exactly what the word implies, Megan. This is my home. It is not a boarding facility for your parents. The bedrooms are not empty. They are full of my wife's memories, and they will not be occupied by people who disrespect this house." The atmospheric pressure in the room snapped. Megan's face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She slammed her hands onto the table, rattling the silverware. "You are being completely unreasonable," she screeched. "My parents are struggling. Colin and I are trying to save for our future. And you are hoarding a 5-bedroom house all to yourself like some greedy dragon." Gideon puffed up his chest, leaning forward aggressively. "Now listen here, Nolan. You can't just dismiss family when they need help. It is the Christian thing to do." I did not break eye contact with Megan. "You are not my family, Gideon," I replied softly. "And Megan, your inability to manage your finances does not constitute an emergency on my part." The truth hit her like a physical blow. Her rationalizations evaporated, replaced by a visceral screeching fury. It was then that Colin finally found his voice, but not to act as a peacemaker. He stood up, knocking his chair backward. "Dad, you are being selfish!" he yelled, pointing an accusing finger at me. "You sit in this massive house all alone, feeling sorry for yourself. Megan is just trying to help her family, and you are throwing it in our faces." The betrayal was absolute. My own son, my flesh and blood, was actively participating in the attempted theft of my sanctuary. But my engineering mind had already compartmentalized the pain. I was no longer speaking to a son. I was assessing a hostile threat. "Colin," I said, my voice dropping to a glacial, terrifying calm. "If you believe I am selfish for protecting what is mine, then you are welcome to leave my property and never return. Evelyn's home will not be hijacked by parasites." The word parasites severed the last thread of Megan's sanity. With a guttural scream, she grabbed the heavy lead crystal wine goblet sitting next to her plate. She did not hesitate. She hurled it directly at my face with all the force she could muster. The physics of the moment seemed to slow down. I saw the dark red liquid spinning in the air, the facets of the crystal catching the dining room chandelier. There was no time to dodge. The heavy base of the glass struck me squarely just above my left eyebrow. The crystal shattered on impact, exploding into a dozen razor-sharp shards that rained down onto the table. A blinding flash of pain ripped through my skull. The warm metallic scent of blood instantly mixed with the smell of spilled wine. Blood poured down my forehead, dripping into my left eye and splashing onto my crisp white shirt. The room froze in absolute terror. Sylvia let out a horrified gasp, covering her mouth with her hands. Gideon stumbled backward. His bravado entirely vanished. Colin stood frozen, his eyes wide, staring at the blood pouring down his father's face. He took a half-step forward, his mouth opening to speak, but no words came out. Megan stood there, her chest heaving, her hand still raised from the throw, oscillating between terror at what she had just done and a stubborn, lingering defiance. They expected me to scream. They expected me to clutch my face, to curse, to retaliate with violence. They expected the chaotic reaction of a victim. Instead, I reached slowly across the table and picked up a clean linen napkin. I pressed it firmly against the deep gash on my forehead. I felt the warm blood soaking rapidly through the fabric. I looked at the dark red stains on the mahogany wood, then raised my gaze to meet Megan's terrified eyes. I did not show anger. I did not show pain. I simply smiled. It was a cold, calculated, blood-stained smile that communicated absolute, terrifying certainty. It was the smile of a man who had just been handed the exact weapon he needed to annihilate his enemies. Without uttering a single word, I stood up from my chair. I turned my back on the silent, horrified room, walked steadily to the front door, and pulled it open. I stepped out into the cool evening air and pulled the heavy oak door shut behind me with a definitive echoing thud. The drive to the emergency room took 12 minutes. I navigated the dark suburban streets with a terrifying mental clarity. The physical pain throbbing above my eye was entirely eclipsed by the cold, mechanical precision of my thoughts. For months, I had suspected that Colin's financial life was a rotting edifice. I had noticed the subtle demands for cash, the extravagant vacations funded by invisible wealth, the desperate ambition in Megan's eyes. I had quietly retained Desmond Wright, the most ruthless and discreet attorney in the state, to draft a series of financial firewalls around my estate. I had structured a poison pill in my assets, a bad actor clause, that would instantaneously sever all financial lifelines and freeze my estate if any physical or legal threat was made against me. Megan's violent outburst was not just an assault. It was the catalyst that would activate the demolition of their entire world. I walked into the emergency room lobby, the linen napkin now completely saturated with dark blood. The triage nurse took one look at my face and immediately rushed me into a trauma cubicle. The bright, sterile lights of the hospital washed over me as a doctor began to clean the wound. It was a deep laceration that required 8 stitches. While the doctor carefully threaded the needle through my skin, I pulled my phone from my pocket with my free hand. I opened my messages and found Desmond's contact. I did not type an explanation. I did not type a frantic plea for help. I simply typed 4 words. Phase 1 is complete. I hit send. The trap was now primed. Next, I dialed 911. The dispatcher answered immediately. "I need to report an assault with a deadly weapon at my residence," I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. I provided my address and explained that I was currently receiving stitches at the hospital. When the dispatcher asked who had assaulted me, I answered with chilling calm. "My daughter-in-law, Nolan Barrett. She hurled a crystal glass at my head. She is currently trespassing in my home along with her husband and her parents. I want her arrested." As I disconnected this call, my phone began to vibrate relentlessly in my palm. It was Colin. I let it ring. Then came the notification of a voicemail. Then another. Then a text. Then a third voicemail. While the doctor bandaged my head, I pressed the phone to my ear and listened to my son's frantic voice. "Dad. Dad." "Pick up the phone," the first voicemail crackled, his voice thick with panic and pathetic manipulation. "Listen, what happened was an accident. Megan didn't mean to throw it at you. It just slipped. You provoked her by being so hostile. Please don't make a big deal out of this. Come back to the house so we can talk this out like a family. Don't do anything stupid." The second voicemail was darker, shifting from gaslighting to desperate extortion. "Dad, if you call the cops, you are going to ruin Megan's career. You are going to ruin my life over a stupid argument. If you try to press charges, I swear to God, I will tell everyone you attacked her first. I will drag your name through the mud. You owe us, Dad. You owe me. You can't do this to your own son." I downloaded every single audio file. I backed them up to a secure cloud server and forwarded the copies directly to Desmond's encrypted email. Colin was hopelessly out of his depth. He thought he was intimidating an old man. He did not realize he was supplying a master architect with the exact blueprints needed to dismantle his life. The extortion threats were the final nails in his coffin. As I stood up from the hospital bed, the doctor handed me my discharge papers and a prescription for painkillers. I thanked him politely, folded the papers into my pocket, and walked out of the sliding glass doors into the night. My head was heavily bandaged, throbbing with a dull ache, but my vision had never been clearer. The silent, accommodating father was dead. The architect of their ruin had arrived. The police were already on their way to my home, and the avalanche of consequences was about to crush the parasites who thought they could conquer me. The flashing red and blue lights sliced through the quiet suburban darkness, reflecting off the large oak trees that lined the edge of my property. I sat in the driver's seat of my sedan parked half a block away, watching two police cruisers pull silently into my driveway. I had requested they cut the sirens when they turned onto my street. I wanted the element of surprise. I wanted the arrogant inhabitants of my home to feel the absolute, unyielding grip of reality closing around their throats without a single warning. The dull throbbing above my left eye was a constant rhythm, a physical reminder of the 8 stitches holding my skin together. But the pain was secondary. My mind was a fortress of calculated precision. I stepped out of the car, the cool night air bracing against my face, and walked toward the lead officer who was stepping out of his vehicle. I handed him the discharge papers from the emergency room along with a printed photograph the triage nurse had taken of my face before the wound was cleaned. The officer turned on his flashlight, examining the photograph, and then looking up at the fresh, bloody bandage on my forehead. He did not ask unnecessary questions. The physical evidence was undeniable. I told him quietly that the woman who threw the glass was still inside my home, likely drinking my wine, completely unaware that her actions had consequences. I handed over my spare house key. I told them I would wait by the door. I had no desire to engage in a screaming match. I only wanted to watch the illusion of their control shatter as completely as the crystal glass had shattered against my skull. The officers approached the heavy oak front door. One of them knocked loudly, the sound echoing through the peaceful neighborhood. For a moment, there was silence from inside. Then I heard the muffled sound of footsteps. The door swung open. Colin stood there. He had his suit jacket off the sleeves of his expensive dress shirt rolled up to his elbows, holding a fresh glass of Cabernet. A smug, expectant look was plastered across his face. He clearly thought I had come crawling back to apologize for being unreasonable. The smugness evaporated the exact second his eyes registered the dark blue uniforms and the heavy duty belts of the 2 officers standing on his childhood porch. "Good evening," the lead officer said, his voice carrying the flat, uncompromising authority of the law. "We are responding to a report of an aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. We need to speak with Nolan Barrett." Colin froze. His corporate sales manager persona, the one he relied on to charm his way out of every deficit in his life, completely misfired. He stammered, his eyes darting to the squad cars parked in the driveway. "Officers, there has been a massive misunderstanding." He began, his voice pitching higher with sudden panic. "My father is an older man. He gets confused and highly emotional. We had a minor family disagreement at dinner and he tripped. It was an accident. No one assaulted anyone. He is just trying to cause trouble because we had a disagreement about living arrangements." The officer did not blink. He stepped forward, forcing Colin to step back into the foyer. The police entered my home. I followed quietly behind them, stepping into the entryway, letting the shadows of the porch conceal me for a moment. The living room was exactly as I had left it. Gideon and Sylvia were sitting on my leather sofas, looking like stunned pigeons. Megan was standing near the dining room archway. She was still wearing her expensive pastel Easter dress, a garment purchased with money I now knew they did not truly have. When she saw the police, the color drained entirely from her face, leaving her looking hollow and terrified. "Are you Nolan Barrett?" the officer asked, walking directly toward her. Megan opened her mouth, but a small, pathetic squeak was all that came out. She looked at Colin silently, begging him to fix the situation, to use his silver tongue to erase the consequences of her rage. Colin rushed forward, stepping between his wife and the officers. "Listen to me, you cannot just walk into my house and interrogate my wife. My father is not in his right mind." He fell and hit his head on the table. "He is vindictive. You need to leave before I call my lawyer." The second officer walked past Colin, his flashlight illuminating the dining room. The bright beam swept across the mahogany table. It highlighted the shattered remnants of the heavy crystal wine goblet scattered across the wood. It illuminated the dark, pooling stains of my blood soaking into the expensive table runner. The officer turned back to Colin, his expression hardening into stone. Does your father often trip and fall with enough force to shatter a heavy crystal goblet across the room, while simultaneously bleeding directly onto a chair positioned 3 feet away?" the officer asked. Colin's mouth snapped shut. His lie had collided with undeniable physical reality, and it disintegrated instantly. Gideon and Sylvia stood up from the sofa, their faces pale with terror. Gideon, who just hours ago had bellowed about Christian duty and family obligations, suddenly looked incredibly small. He realized the gravity of the situation. He recognized that the daughter he had raised to be ruthlessly ambitious had just committed a felony. "Nolan Barrett," the lead officer said, pulling a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back. You are being placed under arrest for assault with a deadly weapon." The command broke the spell in the room. Megan let out a piercing, hysterical shriek. She scrambled backward, her expensive heels slipping on the hardwood floor. "No. You cannot do this. It was his fault. He provoked me. He insulted my parents. He told us to leave. He is a horrible, selfish old man." Her confession tumbled out in a panicked rush. In her desperate attempt to justify her violence, she inadvertently admitted to the crime right in front of the arresting officers. The officer caught her by the arm, swiftly turning her around. The sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs echoing through the dining room was the most satisfying sound I had heard in years. It was the sound of boundaries being enforced by iron. Megan began to sob uncontrollably. The tears ruined her makeup, streaming down her face as the reality of a jail cell loomed before her. She looked at her parents. "Dad, do something. Do not let them take me." Gideon took a step back, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. He had no power here. Sylvia covered her face and began to weep. Colin looked completely frantic. He reached for the officer, a foolish, impulsive gesture. The second officer immediately stepped in his hand, resting warningly on his equipment belt. "Sir, if you interfere with a lawful arrest, you will be joining your wife in the back of the cruiser. Step back immediately." Colin raised his hands, his face flushed with humiliation and impotent rage. As they marched Megan toward the front door, she saw me standing in the shadows of the entryway, the white bandage on my forehead stark against the dim light. Her sobs hitched in her throat. She looked at me with a mixture of absolute hatred and dawning terror. I did not say a word. I simply held her gaze, letting her see the complete absence of mercy in my eyes. I watched as the officers led her down the front steps, her pastel dress illuminated by the flashing police lights for the entire neighborhood to see. The front door closed, leaving me alone in the foyer with Colin, Gideon, and Sylvia. The silence was suffocating. I did not look at my former in-laws. I looked directly at my son. His chest was heaving. His fists were clenched at his sides. He had lost control, and for a man who built his entire ego on the illusion of dominance, it was a devastating blow. "Get out of my house," I said. My voice was a low, steady rumble devoid of any paternal warmth. "You have exactly 5 minutes to gather whatever belongings you brought into this home and leave my property. If you are still here when the clock strikes, I will call those officers back and have you all removed for trespassing." Colin stared at me, his eyes burning with a desperate, reckless fury. "You are going to regret this, old man," he hissed, his voice trembling with venom. "You just destroyed my family." "No, Colin," I replied evenly. "I just removed a cancer from my home. The 5-minute countdown has already started." I turned and walked upstairs to my master bedroom, locking the heavy door behind me. I did not need to watch them scramble. I could hear the frantic footsteps downstairs, the hushed, panicked arguments between Colin and his in-laws, the slamming of the front door. When the house finally fell completely silent, I walked over to the window and watched Colin's luxury sedan speed down the driveway, followed closely by Gideon's vehicle. They were gone. But I knew the war was only entering its second phase. I sat down in the leather armchair near my window and looked at my phone. The screen illuminated the dark room. As expected, the notifications began to flood in. Colin, unable to handle the catastrophic collapse of his evening, was attempting to regain control through sheer digital intimidation. My phone vibrated with an incoming voicemail. I pressed play and put it on speaker, my thumb ready to hit the save button. "Dad, you have lost your mind!" Colin's voice crackled through the speaker, thick with desperation and rage. "You just had my wife arrested on Easter. Do you have any idea what this is going to cost in legal fees? Do you know what this will do to her background check? You are going to fix this. You are going to call the police right now and tell them you made a mistake. You are going to drop the charges." I let the recording finish and immediately forwarded it to Desmond's secure inbox. 10 minutes later, a second voicemail arrived. Colin was escalating, shedding his corporate composure for raw, vicious extortion. "Listen to me very carefully, old man." The second message began, his tone dropping into a threatening sneer. "If you do not call the precinct and fix this by morning, I am going to make your life a living hell. I will go to the courts. I will tell them the grief has rotted your brain. I will swear under oath that you have been acting violent and erratic. I will have you declared mentally unfit, and I will take control of that house myself. You think you can throw Megan in a cage and walk away? I know about your accounts. I know how much you depend on my help with the contractors. Drop the charges, or I will lock you in a nursing home and sell that house out from under you. You owe me." I sat in the darkness, the faint glow of the streetlights casting long shadows across the floor. A cold, profound satisfaction washed over me. Colin believed he was intimidating me. He believed his threats would break my resolve. He did not possess the intellectual capacity to realize he had just crossed the legal threshold from emotional manipulation into criminal extortion. He had explicitly threatened to file fraudulent legal proceedings against a senior citizen for financial gain. He had explicitly threatened my freedom and my property if I did not comply with his demands to drop a felony assault charge. I downloaded the second voicemail. I opened a new message to Desmond Wright. I attached both audio files and the photograph of my bloodied face. I typed a single sentence. "I believe we now have sufficient evidence for the emergency restraining order." The digital confirmation chimed in the quiet room. I placed the phone on the nightstand and leaned back in my chair. The throbbing in my head had subsided into a dull rhythm. My son had demanded my home, allowed his wife to draw my blood, and threatened my freedom. He had shown his true face, expecting me to cower in fear. But I was not afraid. I was merely waiting for the morning when the financial guillotine I had meticulously prepared would finally drop. Phase 1 was complete, and the total demolition of Nolan Barrett's life had officially begun. The morning sun hit the glass facade of Desmond Wright's office building, but I felt no warmth. I walked through the heavy doors precisely at 8 o'clock. The bandage on my forehead pulled tightly against my skin, with every step a constant reminder of the previous night's violence. Desmond was already sitting beyond his immaculate desk. He did not offer empty platitudes or fake sympathy. We had known each other for 20 years, and he understood that I was not a man who required comforting. I placed my phone on his desk, followed by the carbon copy of the police report I had obtained at dawn. Desmond picked up the report. His eyes scanned the ink rapidly. "Aggravated assault with a deadly weapon," he read aloud, his voice steady. "Arrest made on the premises." He placed the paper down and looked at my bandaged head. Then he picked up my phone and played the audio files I had forwarded to him during the night. Colin's frantic voice filled the quiet office, escalating from pathetic begging to blatant extortion. The threats echoed off the walls, promising to drag my name through the mud, to have me declared mentally unfit, to lock me in a nursing home if I did not drop the charges against his wife. When the final recording clicked off, the silence in the room was heavy. Desmond steepled his fingers. He handed me a cup of black coffee. "You look remarkably calm for a man whose son just threatened to strip him of his freedom," Desmond noted. I took a sip of the coffee. "I am calm because Colin is playing a game he does not understand," I replied. "He thinks he is holding a royal flush. He does not realize I own the casino." This was not a sudden revelation. My son had not transformed into a monster overnight. The decay had been slow, creeping into his character, like water seeping into a cracked foundation. The first warning signs had appeared 8 months ago. Colin had pulled into my driveway in a brand new luxury sports utility vehicle boasting about his company's record-breaking quarter. Yet less than an hour later, he was standing in my kitchen casually asking if I could cover his property taxes for the season, blaming a temporary cash flow hiccup. A man with a record-breaking quarter does not beg his retired father for tax money. That single contradiction was all the evidence I needed to start digging. As a structural engineer, I spent my life looking for hidden stress fractures. I applied that same rigorous scrutiny to my son's life. What I found was a spectacular house of cards. Colin was drowning in debt. His corporate lifestyle was entirely leveraged. I had originally seeded his business with a large sum of capital years ago, a loan he swore he would pay back within 5 years. He had never repaid a single cent. Instead, he had secretly used my pristine credit history, which I had foolishly linked to his initial corporate accounts, to help him secure lower interest rates to guarantee massive lines of credit for himself. He was treating my financial legacy as his personal slush fund. When I discovered this theft, I did not confront him. Confrontation gives the enemy time to hide their assets. Instead, I came to Desmond. Together, we had spent the last 6 months constructing an invisible, impenetrable legal fortress around my entire estate. We had restructured my trusts, locked my savings behind dual authentication protocols, and most importantly, drafted the bad actor clause. Desmond opened a thick leather file on his desk. He pulled out a document thick with legal jargon and pushed it toward me. The bad actor clause was a mechanism designed for absolute financial annihilation. It explicitly stated that if any beneficiary or their spouse committed an act of physical violence against me, or threatened legal action to forcibly seize control of my assets, their status as a beneficiary would be instantly and irrevocably revoked. Furthermore, it gave Desmond the immediate unilateral authority to sever any shared financial instruments. "Megan shattered a glass against your skull," Desmond said, tapping the police report. "And Colin explicitly threatened to file fraudulent guardianship proceedings to steal your home. They have perfectly triggered every single condition of the clause we drafted." I nodded, feeling the dull ache above my eye pulse with the rhythm of my heartbeat. "I want the protocols activated, Desmond. I want every bridge burned. I want the safety net removed right now." Desmond did not hesitate. He turned to his computer monitor, his fingers flying across the keyboard with lethal precision. "Let us begin with the corporate accounts," he said, his eyes scanning the data on his screen. "Colin has 3 primary business credit cards carrying a combined balance of $70,000. Because these lines of credit are ultimately guaranteed by your personal wealth, I have the authority to report them as compromised and withdraw your guarantor status." "Do it," I commanded. Desmond clicked his mouse. He picked up his office phone and dialed a direct line to the commercial banking division. He provided his authorization codes and gave the order. Within 90 seconds, the financial umbilical cord that had kept Colin afloat was severed. The bank immediately froze the cards to protect their liability. "That takes care of his daily operational capital," Desmond said, ending the call. "Any attempt he makes to purchase inventory, entertain clients, or pay his vendors today will be met with an instant decline." "What about the seed loan?" I asked. "The initial capital I provided to start his firm." Desmond pulled another document from the leather file. "The original contract you signed with him stipulated a 5-year repayment window. We are currently in year 7. He is in default. Because he has now triggered the bad actor clause, I am accelerating the debt collection. I am issuing a formal legal demand for the immediate repayment of the entire sum, plus accumulated interest." The demand letter is being transmitted to his business email and physical office address as we speak. He has 48 hours to produce the funds. "He does not have the funds," I stated flatly. "He is leveraged to the breaking point. Then his firm will be forced into receivership." Desmond replied without a trace of pity. "We will place a lien on his business assets by Friday. He will be legally barred from liquidating any equipment or client contracts until your debt is satisfied." The efficiency of the destruction was deeply satisfying. Colin had stood in my dining room, yelling that I was selfish, while silently draining my credit to fund the very arrogance he wielded against me. He believed his position as my son shielded him from the consequences of his actions. He was about to learn that biology is not a shield against accountability. Now, regarding the extortion, Desmond continued shifting his focus to a new set of papers. Colin's voicemails are a textbook violation of the law. He threatened to file a fraudulent competency hearing to seize your real estate unless you dropped felony charges against his wife. That is witness tampering and extortion. I am submitting these audio files to the district attorney this morning to augment the assault case against Megan. Will it be enough for a restraining order, I asked. I do not want him setting foot on my property ever again. Desmond smiled a thin, predatory smile. It is more than enough. I am requesting an emergency ex parte order of protection. Given the physical assault by his wife and his subsequent recorded threats, a judge will sign it before noon. Colin will be legally forbidden from coming within 500 feet of you or your residence. If he attempts to return to the house, he will join his wife in a holding cell. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling a long, slow breath. The machinery of justice was finally in motion. There would be no more fake smiles at family dinners. There would be no more biting my tongue while Megan evaluated my home like a buzzard circling a dying animal. The rotting pillars of my family structure had been kicked away, and I was perfectly content to watch the roof collapse on their heads. Desmond's computer chimed with an incoming notification. He opened the message and looked up at me, his eyes gleaming with professional satisfaction. The commercial bank has confirmed the freeze, he announced. Colin's corporate accounts are entirely locked. He has zero liquidity. The demand letter for the defaulted loan has been successfully delivered and logged. The financial trap has officially snapped shut. I stood up from the chair. The bandage on my forehead felt like a badge of honor. Thank you, Desmond. Keep me updated on the restraining order. Where are you going now? Desmond asked, organizing the chaotic stack of papers into a neat, terrifying pile. I am going home, I replied. I left a mess in the dining room last night, and I suspect I will have uninvited guests trying to claim the territory while they think I am weak. I walked out of Desmond's office and stepped back into the morning sun. The air felt cleaner. Somewhere in the city, Colin was likely sitting at a coffee shop or a luxury diner, trying to buy an expensive breakfast, waiting for his plastic card to be rejected. He was about to discover that the safety net he had taken for granted his entire life had vanished, leaving him in a free fall of his own making. I unlocked my car and started the engine, heading back to the sanctuary I had fought so hard to build, ready to face the collateral invaders who thought they could simply walk in and take over. The midday sun glared off the windshield as I turned onto my street. The neighborhood was quiet. The manicured lawns and silent driveways usually offered a sense of profound peace. But as my house came into view, that peace evaporated. Parked at an aggressive angle across my driveway was a battered silver minivan. It sat on my pristine cobblestone pavers, leaking a dark puddle of oil onto the stone. I pulled my car to the curb and turned off the engine. I did not feel a spike of anger. I felt the cold, clinical precision of a man identifying a structural failure. I stepped out of the vehicle and walked slowly up the gentle slope of the driveway. The air was thick with the scent of pine needles and the unmistakable grinding whine of a power drill. I moved silently across the grass to avoid the crunch of the gravel. As I rounded the corner of the large oak tree framing the front porch, the source of the noise became clear. Gideon was standing on my welcome mat. He was holding a heavy-duty drill, leaning his entire body weight against my front door. Metal shavings from my antique brass lock were piling up on the porch planks. Sylvia stood a few feet behind him. She had her arms crossed over her chest and a cheap plastic bag from a discount hardware store dangling from her wrist. She was tapping her foot impatiently. "Push harder," Gideon Sylvia commanded in her shrill voice. "We need to get these new locks installed before that old man comes back from his lawyer's office." Megan said he left the hospital in a daze. If we secure the perimeter now, we establish residency. That is what the internet said. I stood at the bottom of the porch stairs and watched them. They were actively dismantling the physical barrier of my home. Evelyn and I had picked out that brass lock in a small antique shop in Boston 30 years ago. It was solid and heavy and carried a lifetime of memories. Gideon was destroying it because his daughter had ordered him to invade my territory. I did not shout. I did not demand they stop. I placed my foot on the first wooden step and let the floorboard creak beneath my weight. Gideon spun around. The drill slipped from the lock and gouged a deep, ugly scratch into the oak door. He lowered the tool, but he did not look guilty. He looked defiant. Sylvia jumped slightly, clutching the plastic bag to her chest, but her surprise quickly morphed into a smug smile. "Well, look who decided to show up," Gideon sneered. He wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "You should have stayed away, Nolan. You look terrible." I kept my hands relaxed at my sides. I looked at the gouged wood, the metal shavings, and then at the drill in his hand. "What exactly are you doing to my front door, Gideon?" Sylvia stepped forward, puffing out her chest. "We are securing our new residence," she announced, with a ridiculous level of unearned authority. Megan called us from the police station right before they took her phone. She told us everything. She told us how you provoked her and had her wrongfully arrested. But she also told us she gave us verbal authorization to occupy the guest rooms. We are officially tenants now, Nolan. We have tenant rights. You cannot legally lock us out, so we are changing the locks to make sure you do not try anything illegal. The sheer magnitude of their ignorance was staggering. They believed a verbal promise from a woman sitting in a jail cell. A woman who possessed zero ownership stake in the property somehow granted them legal immunity to break and enter. They were operating on a toxic combination of greed and internet misinformation. "You do not have tenant rights," I said softly. "You do not have a lease. You do not have ownership. You are currently vandalizing a private residence." Gideon scoffed and took a step toward me. The drill was still gripped tightly in his right hand. "You listen to me, you arrogant old fool. Megan is family. Colin is family. That means we are family. We have a right to be here. We know Colin has been paying for the upkeep of this place anyway. He told us he practically owns it. You are going to go inside, pack a bag, and go stay at a hotel until we figure out what to do with you. If you try to stop us, I will tell the cops you attacked me just like you attacked my daughter." He was standing 2 feet away from me. I could smell the stale coffee and aggressive cologne radiating from him. He was trying to use physical intimidation against a man who had just taken a crystal glass to the skull without flinching. I looked at the power tool in his hand. I looked at Sylvia, who was nodding in agreement with her husband's threats. They had crossed the threshold of mere annoyance and stepped firmly into the realm of criminal trespass and attempted burglary. I did not raise my voice. I did not engage in a debate about property law. I simply reached my right hand into my trouser pocket. My fingers wrapped around the small plastic security fob attached to my keychain. The system I had installed after Evelyn passed was state-of-the-art. It included a silent panic button that bypassed the monitoring company and sent an immediate high-priority distress signal directly to the local police dispatch. I pressed the button and held it down for 3 continuous seconds. I felt the faint vibration confirm the signal was sent. "Are you deaf?" Gideon barked, waving his free hand in my face. I said, "Go pack a bag." I withdrew my empty hand from my pocket. I walked past Gideon, ignoring his aggressive posture, and calmly sat down in the wicker rocking chair at the far end of the porch. The chair creaked a gentle rhythmic sound as I pushed back and forth. "I am not going anywhere," I replied. "I am going to sit right here and enjoy the morning breeze. You can continue whatever it is you think you are doing." Gideon and Sylvia exchanged a confused glance. They had prepared for a screaming match. They had prepared for a physical altercation. My absolute compliance short-circuited their limited tactical planning. Gideon grunted, turning his back to me, and raised the drill to the door again. The whining sound of the motor resumed. Sylvia stood beside him, occasionally casting nervous glances in my direction. "You are going to regret putting my daughter in a cell," Sylvia muttered over the noise of the drill. Colin is hiring the best lawyer in the city right now. He is going to take everything from you. He is going to leave you with nothing." I smiled. I let the cool breeze wash over my bandaged forehead. I knew that Colin was currently staring at frozen bank accounts and locked credit lines. He could not afford a public defender, let alone the best lawyer in the city. His financial life was rapidly decomposing, and his in-laws were completely oblivious to the impending collapse. The wait lasted exactly 8 minutes. The distant wail of sirens cut through the suburban quiet. The sound grew rapidly, amplifying from a faint hum to a deafening roar. Gideon stopped drilling. He lowered the tool, turning his head toward the street. The smugness drained out of his face, replaced by a sudden creeping anxiety. Sylvia dropped the plastic bag of cheap locks onto the porch floor. 3 police cruisers tore around the corner. They did not slow down to admire the neighborhood. They drove their vehicles directly onto my front lawn, tearing up the grass and coming to a sudden, aggressive halt mere feet from the porch. The doors flew open. 5 officers stepped out simultaneously. 2 of them had their hands resting firmly on their holstered weapons. The emergency dispatch had received a panic alarm, indicating a home invasion in progress at a residence that had already seen a violent felony assault the previous night. The police were not taking any chances. "Drop the weapon and step away from the door." The lead officer bellowed, his voice echoing like thunder across the lawn. Gideon froze. He looked down at his hand, suddenly realizing that he was gripping a heavy power drill. In the context of a reported home invasion, the tool was indistinguishable from a deadly weapon. Panic seized his features. "I said drop it right now," the officer commanded, drawing his taser and pointing the red laser sight directly at Gideon's chest. Gideon let out a pathetic squeak of terror. He dropped the drill. It hit the wooden planks with a heavy thud and rolled away. He threw his hands into the air, his knees shaking so violently I could hear his joints popping. Sylvia let out a horrified scream and backed away, pressing herself flat against the exterior brick wall of my house. "Get on the ground face down, hands behind your head," the second officer shouted, moving rapidly up the porch steps. Gideon did not argue. He collapsed onto his stomach, laying spread eagle on the metal shavings from my ruined lock. Sylvia was hyperventilating, crying out that there was a mistake, that they had tenant rights, that they were family. The officers ignored her entirely. 2 of them knelt beside Gideon, pinning his arms behind his back and securing his wrists with steel handcuffs. Another officer grabbed Sylvia by the arm, spinning her around and cuffing her despite her frantic struggles. "You do not understand," Sylvia wailed, tears streaming down her face. "We have verbal permission to be here. Megan told us we could move in. That man is trying to steal our home." The lead officer walked over to me. I was still sitting peacefully in the wicker rocking chair. He recognized me from the hospital report the night before. "Are you unharmed, Mr. Barrett?" he asked, his tone shifting to respectful concern. "I am perfectly fine, officer," I replied, standing up slowly. "I returned from a meeting with my attorney to find these 2 individuals destroying my front door and attempting to breach my home. They threatened me with physical violence if I tried to stop them." Gideon lifted his head from the wooden planks, his face red and contorted with fury. "He is lying. We are his family. You cannot arrest us for visiting our family." The officer looked down at Gideon with total disgust. "You are under arrest for attempted burglary, vandalism, and criminal trespass," the officer stated. "You have the right to remain silent. I strongly suggest you start using it." They hoisted Gideon to his feet. He looked completely defeated. The blustering, arrogant man who had ordered me out of my own home just 15 minutes ago was now a trembling, handcuffed criminal. They dragged him down the steps and shoved him into the back of the first cruiser. Sylvia was crying hysterically as they placed her in the second vehicle. Her shrill voice faded behind the thick safety glass of the police car. I stood on the edge of the porch and watched the red and blue lights flash against the oak trees. Phase 2 of my operation was completely successful. Colin had sent his attack dogs to secure the property, and I had effortlessly locked them in cages. The enemy forces were now fighting a massive, unwinnable war on 2 entirely separate legal fronts. Megan was sitting in a jail cell facing felony assault charges. Her parents were now booked for attempted burglary. The bail amounts would be astronomical, and Colin had absolutely zero access to capital to free them. I turned around and looked at my front door. The brass lock was mangled, destroyed beyond repair. It was a minor inconvenience. I would call a locksmith in the afternoon. For now, the house was quiet again. I walked inside, stepping over the cheap plastic bag of hardware Sylvia had dropped. I closed the heavy oak door. The silence in the hallway was deep and restorative. I had surgically excised the invading parasites from my territory. Now all that remained was the total destruction of the man who had orchestrated the infection. My son was entirely alone, and the real audit of his betrayal was about to begin. The morning sun baked the pavement outside the window, but I felt nothing but a glacial calm. Across town, inside the concrete walls of the county precinct, Megan was wearing her ruined Easter dress, sitting on a steel bench, waiting for a savior who possessed no power to save her. Colin was scrambling. I could visualize his panic. He was a man who lived on the illusion of infinite resources, a man who threw his credit card at every inconvenience. Now those cards were plastic ghosts. The commercial freeze Desmond initiated was absolute. Every swipe Colin attempted at the bail bondsman office would return a flat terminal decline. He could not leverage his assets, because his assets were a mirage built on my foundation. With his wife locked in a holding cell, and his in-laws being fingerprinted in the same building, Colin was completely isolated. But his immediate lack of liquidity was merely the tremor before the earthquake. The real devastation was currently loading on the glowing monitors in Desmond Wright's inner office. I sat in the leather chair opposite Desmond, watching the reflection of financial spreadsheets dance across his glasses. We were not merely closing bank accounts. We were conducting a forensic autopsy on my son's life. Desmond had invoked a sweeping discovery clause embedded in the original guarantor agreement. It allowed us full, unobstructed access to every ledger, every transaction history, and every loan application Colin's firm had executed over the past 5 years. The sheer volume of the data was staggering, but Desmond was a predator in his natural habitat. He clicked through the files with ruthless efficiency, searching for the origin of the rot. The silence in the room was punctuated only by the sharp clicks of the mouse. As I watched the numbers scroll past, my mind drifted back to a crisp autumn morning 5 years ago. I remembered sitting at my kitchen island holding a fountain pen over a personal check. Colin had stood across from me wearing a sharp suit, vibrating with a contagious, nervous energy. He had presented a meticulously bound business plan, outlining a commercial supply company that he swore would revolutionize local distribution. He did not ask for a handout. He asked for an investment. I remembered looking into his eyes and seeing a hunger I mistook for ambition. I wrote the check for $150,000. It was a seed loan drawn from the savings Evelyn and I had accumulated over decades of careful living. The terms were clear and legally binding, a 5-year repayment window with a modest interest rate. In that moment, handing him the check, I felt a profound swell of paternal pride. I believed I was launching a legacy. I did not know I was simply financing a deeply entitled fraud. "Look at this," Desmond said, breaking the silence and pulling me back to the cold reality of the present. He rotated his monitor so I could see the screen. His finger traced a descending red line across a graph. Colin's legitimate revenue stream began to collapse 24 months ago. He lost 2 major supply contracts back to back. By all objective metrics, the firm should have filed for bankruptcy a year and a half ago. Their operating costs far exceeded their income. I leaned forward, studying the numbers. Yet his lifestyle did not change, I observed. He leased the luxury sports utility vehicle 10 months ago. He rented that exorbitant downtown apartment. He took Megan to the Amalfi Coast last summer. If the business was bleeding out, where did the capital originate? That is exactly the question I am answering. Desmond replied, his voice dropping into a register of lethal concentration. He opened a new folder labeled Liabilities. The screen flooded with a list of commercial loans and revolving credit lines. Colin was not generating revenue. He was generating debt. He was using one credit line to pay the minimum balances on another, creating a massive financial centrifuge. But the mathematics still do not align. A commercial bank does not extend this level of unsecured credit to a failing business. He simply did not have the collateral to justify these approvals. Desmond typed a rapid sequence of commands, pulling up the original loan applications from the digital archives. The bank had provided the PDFs as part of the total freeze protocol. He clicked on the most recent application, a commercial revolving line of credit, approved just 8 months prior for $250,000. I stared at the document. It was a standard commercial agreement filled with dense boilerplate text and liability waivers. Scroll down to the guarantor section. I said, a sudden heavy knot forming in the pit of my stomach. My engineering background trained me to look for the structural load bearers. $250,000 required a massive load bearer. Desmond scrolled to the final page of the document. The breath caught in my throat. There on the glowing screen was my name, Nolan Barrett, printed in neat type as the primary guarantor backing the entirety of the $250,000 debt with my personal estate. Below the printed name was my signature. I stared at the cursive loops, the precise angle of the letter N, the deliberate crossing of the T. It was a perfect, flawless replication of my handwriting. It was the signature I had spent 40 years perfecting on blueprints, on structural assessments, on the deed to my home. But I had never signed this document. He forged it. I whispered the words, tasting like ash in my mouth. Desmond zoomed in on the signature. His face remained an emotionless mask, but his eyes hardened. "Are you absolutely certain, Nolan? If you did not sign this document, we have crossed a very dark threshold." "I am certain," I replied, my voice gaining strength, locking into a cold, absolute certainty. "Look at the date. October 12th of last year. Evelyn's sister had suffered a mild heart attack that week. I was in Ohio sitting in a cardiac waiting room for 4 days. I was nowhere near a commercial bank, and I certainly did not authorize my son to leverage my estate to fund his wife's European vacations." Desmond clicked rapidly, pulling up 3 more loan applications dating back over the last 18 months. Each one bore the same forged signature. Each one pledged my home, my savings, and my investments as collateral for Colin's reckless greed. The total fraudulent exposure was hovering near $500,000. My son had not just made poor business decisions. He had meticulously, systematically, and criminally stolen my identity. The depth of the betrayal was staggering. While Colin was sitting at my dining room table calling me selfish, while Megan was hurling crystal glasses at my head, complaining about my home, they were secretly draining my lifeblood. They believed they could bleed me dry in the shadows while simultaneously demanding my physical space in the light. Colin had calculated that his father was a soft target, an old man blinded by familial duty who would never audit the digital paperwork of a beloved son. "The complexion of this entire situation has just fundamentally altered," Desmond stated, leaning back in his chair and folding his hands. "This is no longer merely a civil dispute regarding a defaulted seed loan. This is no longer just a family squabble or a misdemeanor domestic issue. Colin utilized digital platforms to transmit these forged documents across state lines to secure funds from a federally insured institution. What does that mean in practical terms?" I asked, though the cold logic of the situation was already forming in my mind. "It means Colin committed federal wire fraud." Desmond answered, his voice razor sharp. "It means he committed aggravated identity theft. The assault by his wife is a local police matter. What we are looking at on this screen is the jurisdiction of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The penalties for these offenses are not civil judgments or fines. They carry mandatory federal prison sentences." I looked away from the monitor and stared out the window at the bustling city below. I thought about the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle. I thought about the man who had stood in my foyer last night, threatening to have me locked in a nursing home if I did not submit to his extortion. He had built his entire world on a foundation of lies, and he had used my name as the mortar. The pain of the realization was profound, but it was rapidly consumed by a cleansing, absolute resolve. I would not allow a parasite to destroy the legacy I had built with Evelyn. I would not protect a criminal simply because we shared a bloodline. The tumor had to be excised completely regardless of the pain. Package the loan documents. I ordered, my voice completely devoid of hesitation. Extract every IP address, every timestamp, and every digital footprint associated with these applications. Compile the evidence into a single comprehensive dossier. Desmond nodded, a grim smile touching the corners of his mouth. And once the dossier is compiled, you will contact the fraud division of the commercial bank, I replied. You will inform them that they are holding $500,000 in fraudulent debt, secured by a forged signature. You will provide them with my sworn affidavit that I did not authorize these lines of credit. The bank will have no choice but to immediately initiate their own federal fraud investigation to protect their shareholders. They will turn the evidence over to the federal authorities. Desmond began typing furiously, executing the commands with lethal speed. The bank will panic, he noted. They will immediately demand the full balance from Colin's firm to mitigate their losses. When he cannot pay, which we know he cannot, they will seize his business assets and refer the forgery to the federal prosecutor. He will be fighting a war on a third front with no resources and no allies. I watched the printer in the corner of Desmond's office begin to hum, spitting out the pages of my son's destruction. Megan was trapped in a local cell, relying on a husband who was legally prohibited from accessing a single dollar. Gideon and Sylvia were sitting in a booking room, waiting for a bailout that would never arrive. And Colin, the architect of this entire miserable enterprise, was about to receive a phone call from a federal investigator. The trap had not merely snapped shut. It had crushed the bones of my enemies. The silent reckoning had arrived, and it was absolute. The digital guillotine fell on Colin before the sun even reached its peak. He sat in his rented downtown office, staring at a computer screen that flashed red across every financial portal. His primary commercial accounts were completely locked. His revolving credit lines showed a zero balance available. Then came the email from his commercial bank. It was a formal notification that his guarantor had submitted an affidavit of forgery and that a federal fraud investigation was officially underway. Colin tried to call his bank manager. The call was routed directly to the legal department, where a cold voice informed him that his business assets were now frozen pending the federal probe. He had no money to post bail for his wife. He had no money to pay his vendors. He had no money to cover his own extravagant rent. The walls of his carefully constructed illusion were caving in and crushing him under the weight of his own arrogance. Panic is a dangerous motivator for a man who lacks a moral compass. Instead of accepting defeat and seeking a legitimate defense, Colin chose to double down on his deception. He needed a way to invalidate the financial freeze. He needed a way to silence me. He needed a legal maneuver so aggressive it would completely shift the balance of power. Since he could no longer afford a reputable firm, Colin sought out the bottom feeders of the legal profession. He found a man named Vance, an attorney known for filing frivolous lawsuits and manipulating the family court system for quick settlements. Colin rushed into Vance's cramped office, smelling of stale sweat and desperation. He spun a pathetic narrative. He claimed that I was a confused, angry old man who was destroying the family business out of spite. Then Colin played his final desperate card. He told Vance about the Easter dinner. He completely omitted the fact that Megan had assaulted me. Instead, Colin claimed that I had suffered a terrible accident. He said I had fallen and struck my head against the dining table, causing a severe brain injury. Colin insisted that this supposed brain damage had made me paranoid and erratic, leading me to freeze his accounts and falsely accuse his wife of a crime she did not commit. Vance saw an opportunity for a massive payout. He immediately drafted an emergency petition for guardianship. He argued that I was a danger to myself and my estate, and that I required an immediate involuntary psychological evaluation. The goal was to have me declared mentally unfit. If Colin became my legal guardian, he would gain absolute control over my entire estate. He could withdraw the fraud allegations, unfreeze the bank accounts post-bail for his wife, and force me into a locked medical facility. It was a vile masterstroke of cruelty. The plan required speed and surprise. Colin knew he had to catch me off guard before Desmond could file any further protective orders. The very next morning, my doorbell rang with an aggressive, insistent rhythm. I was sitting in my living room sipping a cup of chamomile tea. I set my cup down on the saucer and walked slowly to the foyer. I opened the front door to find Colin standing on my porch. He was flanked by Vance and a stern-looking woman holding a thick clipboard. Colin's eyes darted nervously, but he forced his face into a mask of deep sorrow and filial concern. He looked at the white bandage on my forehead and shook his head as if he were looking at a tragic stranger. Colin spoke first, using a gentle, patronizing tone designed for an audience. He said they were so worried about me. He said I had not been acting like myself since I hit my head, and that I was making irrational decisions and tearing our family apart. He claimed he brought someone here to help me get the medical care I needed. The woman with the clipboard stepped forward. She introduced herself as a court-appointed psychiatric evaluator. She explained that an emergency petition had been filed regarding my mental competency. She stated that given the recent head trauma and my sudden erratic financial behavior, she was required to conduct an immediate neurological and cognitive assessment to determine if I was a danger to my own estate. Vance stood behind them, clutching his briefcase and grinning like a shark smelling blood in the water. He informed me that if I refused to cooperate with the evaluator, they would return with a court order and police officers to have me forcibly removed and committed for a mandatory hold. They thought they had trapped me. They thought I would react with the predictable fury of an old man whose autonomy was being threatened. They expected me to yell, to wave my arms, to order them off my property. They needed me to look crazy. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I simply smiled the exact same cold smile I had given Megan before she threw the glass. I opened the door wider and invited them inside. I gestured for the evaluator to take a seat at my dining room table, precisely where the bloodstains had been meticulously scrubbed away. Colin and Vance exchanged a confused look. My absolute compliance threw their script completely off balance. I walked over to the mahogany sideboard and unlocked the bottom drawer. I retrieved a pristine manila folder and returned to the table. I placed the folder directly in front of the evaluator. I spoke with the calm, measured cadence of an engineer presenting structural data. I told her she was here to assess my cognitive function due to claims of erratic behavior and brain damage. I suggested that before she waste her valuable time asking me to count backward from 100 or identify the current president, she should review the documents inside that folder. The evaluator opened the cover. Inside were 3 distinct, comprehensive medical reports. For the past 6 months, as I built my financial firewalls with Desmond, I knew Colin might eventually attempt this exact legal maneuver. Desperate men always try to attack the mind when they cannot conquer the wallet. To preemptively annihilate any claim of senility, I had proactively visited 3 separate independent neurologists. I had subjected myself to rigorous cognitive exams, memory tests, and psychological evaluations. The most recent exam had been completed just 1 week prior to Easter Sunday. The evaluator scanned the first document. Then she turned the page and read the second. Her professional demeanor shifted from stern authority to absolute incredulity. She read the concluding paragraphs out loud. She read that the patient exhibits exceptional cognitive function, flawless memory retention, and superb executive reasoning skills, scoring in the top percentile for his age demographic. She looked at the signature on the report. It belonged to the chief of neurology at the most prestigious research hospital in the state. She looked up at Colin. Her eyes narrowed with deep professional disgust. She told Colin that his father passed 3 independent neurological evaluations with perfect scores a week ago and was sharper than most men half his age. She stated that Colin filed an emergency petition claiming his father was suffering from acute brain damage due to a recent fall. Yet she noted the only recent medical record she saw was an emergency room discharge paper stating I received stitches for an assault. Colin's face drained of all color. His mouth opened and closed, but he could not form a single word. His entire strategy had shattered against a wall of preemptive evidence. Vance grabbed the edge of the table, his sleazy grin entirely vanished. He realized instantly that he had been manipulated into filing a fraudulent petition based on the lies of a desperate bankrupt client. The evaluator stood up and closed her clipboard with a loud definitive snap. She looked at Vance and delivered a warning that sealed their fate. She told him he used the court system to harass a perfectly competent senior citizen. She promised to submit her report directly to the judge, detailing this gross misuse of state resources. She warned Vance he would be lucky if he did not face sanctions from the Bar Association. I picked up my phone from the table and tapped the screen. I had kept Desmond on an open audio connection since the doorbell rang. Desmond's voice filled the dining room, cutting through the silence with lethal precision. He addressed Vance directly through the speaker. He informed the lawyer that he and his client had just engaged in a documented attempt to file a fraudulent competency petition to gain control of my assets. Desmond declared that this was the absolute definition of malicious prosecution. Desmond then delivered the final devastating blow. He informed them that they had also violated the terms of an emergency restraining order, which was signed by a judge just 20 minutes ago. The order explicitly forbade Nolan Barrett from coming within 500 feet of my property. Colin looked like a man watching a train collide with his life in slow motion. The restraining order meant his mere presence in my dining room was no longer just an annoyance. It was an immediate criminal offense. The evaluator marched out the front door, shaking her head in total disgust. Vance turned to Colin, his face pale with terror. He hissed that Colin had lied to him before sprinting out of the house to save his own legal license. Colin stood alone in my dining room. He had no credit. He had no business. He had no wife. He had no lawyer. He had tried to declare me insane and ended up legally proving his own malicious intent. I pointed to the open front door and advised my son that the police were already on their way. I suggested he start running. He backed away, his eyes wide with total defeat. He stumbled out the door and sprinted down the driveway, his corporate arrogance permanently erased. The counterattack was over, and I had won the battle without raising a single finger. The silence inside my home was a heavy, luxurious blanket. After Colin fled down the driveway, his sleazy attorney trailing behind him like a frightened rat, I finally had the opportunity to breathe. I walked into my study, a room lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and the faint, comforting scent of old paper and leather. I sat behind my desk and activated the large monitor that displayed the feeds from the newly upgraded perimeter cameras. Desmond had been characteristically thorough. Within an hour of the judge signing the emergency ex parte restraining order, a black SUV had parked silently at the edge of my property line. A private security operative named Hayes, a man constructed entirely of muscle and dark suits, now stood watch over the iron gates of my driveway. I poured a fresh cup of coffee and watched the high-definition monitors. I knew the peace was temporary. The legal machinery was churning, but human arrogance always attempts to defy the gears. Megan had been granted bail. A bail bondsman, likely leveraging the last remaining drops of collateral from Gideon and Sylvia, had secured her temporary release. I knew she would not go quietly to a cheap motel to contemplate her felony charges. Megan operated on a frequency of pure, unfiltered entitlement. She believed the world bent to her tantrums. Precisely at 2 p.m, a sleek black town car rolled up to my curb. The driver placed the vehicle in park, but he kept the engine running, clearly instructed to wait. The rear door pushed open, and Megan stepped out onto the asphalt. Even through the digital feed of the security cameras, the degradation of her appearance was striking. She was still wearing the pastel Easter dress, but it was no longer pristine. The fabric was deeply wrinkled, stained with dried sweat, and a few dark, unmistakable speckles of my blood. Her expensive heels scuffed against the pavement, her posture rigid with a simmering, unhinged fury. She believed Colin had handled the situation. She fully expected that I had been cowed into submission, that my threats were the hollow ramblings of an old man, and that she could simply march back into my home pack, her designer luggage, and dictate the terms of our surrender. I increased the volume on the external audio receivers. I wanted to hear every word of her impending collision with reality. Megan marched up the driveway, her eyes fixed on the front door. She did not even register the black SUV until Hayes stepped seamlessly out of the shadows of the oak trees and planted himself directly in her path. He did not cross his arms or adopt an aggressive stance. He simply stood there, an immovable object blocking a deeply irrational force. "Excuse me," Megan snapped, her voice dripping with venomous condescension. "You are blocking my driveway. Move your vehicle immediately. I need to get my belongings." Hayes did not flinch. He reached into the breast pocket of his tailored jacket and produced a thick, folded legal document. "Are you Megan Barrett?" he asked, his voice a flat, professional monotone that offered zero emotional traction. "Yes, I am Megan Barrett," she barked, waving her hand dismissively. "And this is my family's property. My husband pays for the upkeep of this estate. I do not know who you are, but you have exactly 5 seconds to get out of my way before I call the police and have you arrested for trespassing." The profound irony of a woman out on bail for a violent felony threatening to call the police for trespassing was not lost on me. I took a slow sip of my coffee, watching her dig her own grave. "Ma'am, I'm a bonded security contractor, retained by the legal owner of this property, Nolan Barrett." Hayes stated, his voice carrying perfectly across the audio feed. "You are not permitted on these premises. I am officially serving you with an emergency ex parte order of protection signed by a Superior Court judge this morning." Hayes extended his hand, pressing the document directly against her chest. Megan instinctively grabbed the paper, her eyes dropping to the bold legal print. Hayes continued laying out the parameters of her quarantine with absolute precision. "This order stipulates that you are legally prohibited from coming within 500 feet of Nolan Barrett or his primary residence. By standing on this driveway, you are currently in direct violation of a court order. You have exactly 30 seconds to return to your hired vehicle and vacate the area. If you do not comply, I am legally obligated to contact law enforcement." I watched her face on the monitor. I watched the fragile architecture of her reality buckle and snap. She read the signature of the judge. She read the stark, undeniable terms of her banishment. The realization that Colin had not saved her, that the financial empire she thought she married into was a complete mirage, and that she was standing on the street like a common criminal, fractured her mind. She looked up from the paper, her face twisting into a mask of pure feral rage. The polite, ambitious daughter-in-law vanished completely, replaced by the violent parasite I had always known her to be. "This is a joke," she screamed, her voice cracking with hysteria. She crumpled the restraining order and threw it at Hayes's chest. "You cannot keep me out of my own house. That old man is brain damaged. He is crazy. He attacked me. Colin is going to have him locked in a padded room by the end of the week." Hayes did not move. He simply touched his collar, pressing a small button on his radio communicator. "Target is actively violating the perimeter and demonstrating hostile behavior," he murmured quietly. "Dispatch local authorities. Violation of a protective order in progress." Megan lunged forward, attempting to physically bypass a man twice her size. Hayes effortlessly stepped sideways, extending a single arm to block her trajectory. She collided with his forearm, stumbling backward and nearly twisting her ankle on the hard pavement. The physical rejection shattered her last remaining shred of self-control. She turned her fury away from the guard and directed it straight at the security camera mounted above the garage. She knew I was watching. She marched right up to the lens, her eyes wild, her teeth bared in a snarl. "Nolan!" she shrieked, her voice echoing down the quiet suburban street, completely unhinged. "I know you are in there, you pathetic old freak. You think a piece of paper is going to stop me. We are going to take everything from you. We are going to bleed your accounts dry. You are going to lie alone in a state facility, and I am going to sell this ugly, outdated mausoleum to the highest bidder. Do you hear me? You are dead, Nolan. You are completely dead." I sat in the quiet comfort of my study, watching a woman destroy her own life in real time. She was screaming death threats at a victim of her assault while standing in blatant violation of a restraining order, all perfectly captured in high-definition video and crystal-clear audio. She was handing the district attorney an airtight, unassailable case for a bail revocation. The hired driver of the town car, clearly realizing he was parked in the middle of a major legal disaster, did not wait around to collect his fare. He shifted his vehicle into drive and sped away from the curb, leaving Megan entirely stranded on the sidewalk. She turned around just in time to see her only escape route vanishing down the block. "Wait!" she screamed, running a few steps after the car. "Come back here!" But the wail of approaching sirens instantly drowned out her cries. 2 county patrol cruisers swept around the corner, their lights flashing aggressively against the midday sun. They pulled up to the curb, boxing Megan in against the manicured hedges of my property line. The doors flew open, and 3 officers stepped out. I recognized the lead officer from the night before. He looked at Megan, then looked at the crumpled restraining order lying on the driveway. "Nolan Barrett." The officer said, his tone devoid of any patience. "We received a call regarding a violation of a protective order." Megan spun around, pointing a shaking finger at the camera. "He is framing me," she wailed, tears of absolute panic finally spilling down her cheeks. "He is crazy. He locked me out. I just want my clothes. I just want my things. My husband is going to sue all of you." The officer unclipped the handcuffs from his belt. "Ma'am, you were released on bail precisely 4 hours ago, with the explicit condition that you do not return to the scene of a violent felony and that you do not violate any further court orders. You are currently trespassing, violating a superior court restraining order, and screaming physical threats at a witness." "No!" Megan shrieked, backing away until she hit the trunk of the police cruiser. "No, you do not understand. Colin was supposed to fix this," he said. "He filed the papers. He said the old man was going to a home." "Your husband has no authority over a superior court judge," the officer stated coldly, grabbing her arm and spinning her around. "Place your hands behind your back." The fight drained out of her instantly. The metallic ratcheting of the handcuffs echoed through the audio feed, a sharp, beautiful punctuation mark to her hysteria. She collapsed against the side of the police car, sobbing uncontrollably, the devastating reality of her situation finally crushing her ego. Her bail was revoked. There would be no second chances. There would be no luxury hotels or expensive lawyers waiting to bail her out. Colin was financially paralyzed, and Gideon and Sylvia were already sitting in holding cells of their own. She was going straight back to the concrete, and this time the heavy steel doors would remain locked. I watched the officers press her head down and shove her into the back of the cruiser. I watched the doors slam shut. I watched the police cars pull away from the curb, taking the screaming, entitled parasite completely out of my life. I reached out and turned off the monitors. The screens faded to black. The silence of my home returned absolute and pristine. The defensive perimeter held strong, and the offensive demolition was executing flawlessly. I finished my coffee feeling the deep abiding satisfaction of a structure perfectly secured. The enemy forces were incarcerated, their resources were frozen, and the final bill for their treachery was about to come due. The heavy mahogany doors of Desmond Wright's conference room closed with a solid absolute click, sealing the 3 of us inside. Colin sat across from me at the long glass table. He did not look like the aggressive, entitled executive who had stood in my foyer, demanding my surrender just days ago. His designer suit hung loosely on his frame, unpressed and smelling faintly of stale sweat. His eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with dark circles of panic and severe sleep deprivation. His hands rested on the glass, trembling so violently that his gold wedding band clattered against the smooth surface. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap. Desmond sat to my right, his posture impeccably straight, a thick leather portfolio resting in front of him, like a loaded weapon. We did not offer a greeting. We let the silence stretch, forcing Colin to feel the crushing weight of the room. "Dad." Colin began, his voice cracking into a pathetic, desperate whine. Please, you have to stop this. You have made your point. I understand you are angry about Easter. I understand you are upset with Megan. But she is back in a holding cell. Her parents are facing prison time. My business accounts are completely locked. My vendors are threatening to sue me by the end of the week. I have absolutely nothing left. We need to settle this right now as a family. I looked at the man sweating across the table. He was still trying to manipulate the narrative. He was still classifying a violent felony assault as a simple family disagreement. You do not have a family. Colin. I replied, my voice a flat glacial monotone. You have accomplices, and you are not here to settle anything. You are here because you are cornered and you want me to open a door. Colin's face flushed with a desperate, panicked heat. Dad. I am your only son, he pleaded, leaning forward and pressing his hands flat against the glass. You cannot do this to your own flesh and blood. Think about Mom. Think about Evelyn. She would be absolutely horrified to see you treating me this way. She would be heartbroken to see you destroying the family she sacrificed everything for. Do not do this to her memory. The sheer audacity of invoking his mother's name ignited a cold, focused fire in my chest. He had crossed a sacred boundary. Do not ever speak your mother's name in my presence again, I stated, staring directly into his bloodshot eyes. When your mother was dying in hospice care, when she was crying out for you during her final weeks, you did not visit her. You told me you could not make the drive because you had a crucial networking event in the city. You let her die believing her only son was too busy shaking hands to say goodbye. You did not care about her memory then. You only care about her memory now because you think you can use it as a shield to protect your bank accounts. Colin shrank back into his leather chair, as if he had been physically struck. His emotional ammunition was entirely depleted. He had tried arrogance, he had tried threats, and now he had tried weaponizing grief. None of it had worked. Dad, I am begging you. Colin whimpered, tears of absolute panic finally spilling down his cheeks. I will pay you back the seed loan. I promise. Just call the bank and lift the freeze. Call the district attorney and drop the charges against Megan. If you do not help me, I am going to lose the business. I am going to lose the apartment. I will be homeless. You are going to lose your only child over a misunderstanding. Desmond opened his leather portfolio. The sound of the crisp paper turning cut through Colin's pathetic sobbing. You are operating under a fundamental misconception regarding your leverage, Colin Desmond said, his voice clinical and completely devoid of mercy. You believe you are negotiating the terms of a surrender. You are actually attending an autopsy. I reached across the table and pushed a thick, heavy manila dossier toward him. It slid across the smooth glass and stopped precisely inches from his trembling hands. Open it, I commanded. Colin looked at the folder as if it contained a live explosive. He hesitated, wiping his nose with the back of his sleeve, and slowly peeled back the cover. The first document on the stack was a finalized, deeply complex legal transfer of property. Colin stared at the bold print at the top of the page, his eyes darting frantically across the legal jargon. He looked up, his face contorted in total confusion and dawning horror. What is this? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. That is the deed to the property you attempted to steal, I replied smoothly. You spent the last week threatening to declare me mentally incompetent, so you could seize control of my home and sell it to the highest bidder. You banked your entire future on the assumption that you were the sole heir to a multi-million-dollar estate. You were wrong. I allowed him a moment to read the specific clauses highlighted in yellow marker. 6 months ago, when I first suspected your financial decay, I transferred the entire estate, including the house and the surrounding property, into an irrevocable charitable trust, I explained, watching his eyes widen in terror. The trust is dedicated to funding pediatric cancer research in your mother's name. I am no longer the owner of the property. I am merely a lifetime tenant. When I pass away, the estate will be liquidated by the foundation, and every single cent will go to charity. You have no inheritance, Colin. You have absolutely nothing. Colin's mouth opened, but he could not breathe. The massive safety net he had taken for granted, his entire adult life had just vanished before his eyes. He realized he was standing over an endless, terrifying abyss. But the demolition was not finished. Desmond reached over and turned to the second document in the dossier. It was a printed transcript of the voicemails Colin had left on my phone the night of the assault. This is a certified transcript of the digital communications you transmitted to your father, Desmond stated, tapping the page with an expensive pen. You explicitly threatened to file fraudulent guardianship proceedings. You explicitly threatened to commit perjury regarding your father's mental state to extort him into dropping felony assault charges. These transcripts have already been submitted to the district attorney. You are no longer just a witness to your wife's crime. You are now the primary suspect in an active extortion investigation. Colin began to hyperventilate. He clutched his chest, his eyes darting wildly around the room as if looking for an escape route that did not exist. I did not mean it. He gasped, tears pouring down his face. I was just angry. I was just trying to protect my wife. You cannot send your own son to prison. Turn to the next page, I ordered, my voice cutting through his panic like a scalpel. Colin flipped the transcript over with a violently shaking hand. The third document was a copy of a commercial loan application. It was the $250,000 revolving credit line from his primary business bank. At the bottom of the page, magnified and printed in high resolution, was my forged signature. Colin stared at the signature. The last remaining drops of blood drained from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse. He let out a low, guttural moan of absolute despair. He knew exactly what he was looking at, and he knew exactly what it meant. You believed I was a foolish old man, Colin, I said, leaning forward slightly, making sure he absorbed every single word. You believed I would never audit the commercial accounts tied to my name. You believed you could steal my identity, forge my signature, and leverage my life savings to fund your extravagant vacations and your failing business. I did not take the money for myself, Colin sobbed, burying his face in his hands. The business was failing. I needed the capital to keep the supply lines open. I was going to pay it back. I swear I was going to pay it all back before you ever found out. It does not matter what you intended to do with the stolen funds, Desmond interjected, his voice carrying the finality of a judge delivering a sentence. The act of forging a signature to secure capital from a federally insured banking institution is a severe federal offense. When I initiated the commercial freeze yesterday morning, I also submitted a sworn affidavit of forgery to the Commercial Fraud Division. Colin lifted his head, his face contorted in sheer unadulterated terror. You called the bank, he choked out, his eyes wide. The bank has already triggered their internal security protocols, Desmond confirmed ruthlessly. They have officially classified the $500,000 in unsecured debt you generated as a fraudulent loss. They have frozen your business tax identification numbers and referred the entire matter to the federal authorities. You are not facing a simple civil lawsuit for a defaulted seed loan, Colin. You are facing an imminent indictment for federal wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. Colin collapsed against the back of his chair, completely and utterly broken. The grand illusion of his life was gone. His wife was incarcerated and facing years behind bars for a violent assault. His in-laws were facing trial for attempted burglary. His business was dead. His bank accounts were seized, and he was staring down the barrel of a mandatory federal prison sentence. He had walked into the mediation room hoping to manipulate a grieving father. He was leaving as a ruined, destitute criminal. We are finished here, I said, standing up from the glass table. I adjusted my suit jacket and looked down at the weeping, pathetic shell of the man I had once called my son. Dad. Please, Colin whispered, reaching a trembling hand out toward me. What am I supposed to do? Where am I supposed to go? I have nothing left. You are going to reap exactly what you have sown, Colin, I replied, turning my back on him and walking toward the heavy mahogany doors. You threw the glass. I simply let it shatter. Desmond followed me out, leaving Colin alone in the cold conference room, sobbing uncontrollably over the dossier of his own destruction. The mediation was over. The ambush was perfectly executed. There were no more moves left on the board. The silent reckoning had delivered absolute justice, and I was finally free to return to my quiet, peaceful home. The heavy mahogany doors of Desmond Wright's conference room closed with a solid, absolute click, sealing the three of us inside. Colin sat across from me at the long glass table. He did not look like the aggressive, entitled executive who had stood in my foyer demanding my surrender just days ago. His designer suit hung loosely on his frame, unpressed, and smelling faintly of stale sweat. His eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with dark circles of panic and severe sleep deprivation. His hands rested on the glass, trembling so violently that his gold wedding band clattered against the smooth surface. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap. Desmond sat to my right, his posture impeccably straight, a thick leather portfolio resting in front of him, like a loaded weapon. We did not offer a greeting. We let the silence stretch, forcing Colin to feel the crushing weight of the room. "Dad," Colin began, his voice cracking into a pathetic, desperate whine. "Please, you have to stop this. You have made your point. I understand you are angry about Easter. I understand you are upset with Megan. But she is back in a holding cell. Her parents are facing prison time. My business accounts are completely locked. My vendors are threatening to sue me by the end of the week. I have absolutely nothing left. We need to settle this right now as a family." I looked at the man sweating across the table. He was still trying to manipulate the narrative. He was still classifying a violent felony assault as a simple family disagreement. "You do not have a family, Colin," I replied, my voice a flat, glacial monotone. "You have accomplices, and you are not here to settle anything. You are here because you are cornered and you want me to open a door." Colin's face flushed with a desperate, panicked heat. "Dad, I am your only son," pleaded, leaning forward and pressing his hands flat against the glass. "You cannot do this to your own flesh and blood. Think about Mom. Think about Evelyn. She would be absolutely horrified to see you treating me this way. She would be heartbroken to see you destroying the family she sacrificed everything for. Do not do this to her memory." The sheer audacity of invoking his mother's name ignited a cold, focused fire in my chest. He had crossed a sacred boundary. "Do not ever speak your mother's name in my presence again," I stated, staring directly into his bloodshot eyes. "When your mother was dying in hospice care, when she was crying out for you during her final weeks, you did not visit her. You told me you could not make the drive because you had a crucial networking event in the city. You let her die believing her only son was too busy shaking hands to say goodbye. You did not care about her memory then. You only care about her memory now because you think you can use it as a shield to protect your bank accounts." Colin shrank back into his leather chair, as if he had been physically struck. His emotional ammunition was entirely depleted. He had tried arrogance, he had tried threats, and now he had tried weaponizing grief. None of it had worked. Desmond did not allow him a moment to recover. The attorney remained seated at the glass table, his posture rigid. He opened a slim black folder that had been resting beneath the primary dossier. He withdrew a single sheet of paper and placed it squarely in the center of the table. He told Colin that the time for emotional appeals had expired. He explained that we were now shifting from the criminal implications of his forgery to the strict civil liabilities he had incurred. Desmond pointed a polished silver pen at the top of the document. He reminded Colin of the $150,000 seed loan I had provided 5 years ago. He noted that the loan was never a gift. It was a legally binding contract with very specific covenants regarding the preservation of capital and the ethical conduct of the borrower. Colin wiped his nose with a shaking hand. He stammered that the business was frozen and that he could not access any operating capital to make a repayment. He pleaded for a grace period. He promised he could liquidate some warehouse inventory if Desmond would just lift the commercial freeze. Desmond stared at him with blank clinical precision. He informed Colin that the freeze was irreversible because the entire foundation of the company was built on federal wire fraud. He then tapped the pen against the paper. He stated that due to the gross violation of the ethical conduct covenants, the entire original seed loan was now in default. The principal amount, plus 5 years of accrued interest and maximum allowable penalty fees, was due immediately. Desmond calculated the figure out loud. It came to exactly $212,000. Colin let out a ragged, desperate gasp. He leaned over the table and clawed at his own hair. He swore he did not have $200,000. He reminded Desmond that the bank had locked his personal checking accounts and that his credit cards were completely useless. He begged Desmond to understand that he was entirely destitute. Desmond was unmoved. He withdrew a second sheet of paper from the black folder. He told Colin that the seed loan was merely the beginning of his obligations. He slid the paper forward. It was a comprehensive ledger detailing the exact amount of money Colin had fraudulently obtained using my forged signature over the past 18 months. The number printed at the bottom of the column was staggering. It totaled $487,000. Desmond explained that the commercial bank was currently preparing to report this loss to the federal authorities. However, Desmond had negotiated a brief temporary window. Desmond leaned forward and locked his eyes onto Colin's trembling face. He delivered the ultimatum with the cold efficiency of an executioner. He told my son that he had exactly 48 hours to produce a combined total of $699,000. The funds had to be wired directly into a secure escrow account managed by Desmond's law firm. If the money arrived within the 48-hour window, Desmond would reimburse the commercial bank in full and satisfy the defaulted seed loan. He explained that making the bank whole was the only possible way to prevent the fraud division from submitting the unredacted file to the federal prosecutor. Colin stared at the numbers on the paper. His chest heaved with violent, irregular breaths. He looked at Desmond and then looked at me. He began to hyperventilate. He shouted that it was impossible. He screamed that we were asking him to produce nearly $750,000 in 2 days when he could not even afford to buy a cup of coffee. He accused us of setting an impossible trap just to watch him burn. Desmond did not blink. He simply reminded Colin that the trap was built entirely by his own hands. He stated that the 48-hour deadline was absolute. If the wire transfer did not clear the escrow account by precisely 2 p.m. on Friday, the federal authorities would receive the comprehensive dossier of evidence. Desmond assured him that a team of federal agents would be knocking on his door before the weekend was over. The sheer gravity of the ultimatum finally shattered the last remaining barriers of Colin's delusion. He realized that no amount of smooth talking or aggressive posturing could save him. The numbers were absolute. The deadline was absolute. But like a drowning man grasping at a razor-sharp lifeline, Colin suddenly lunged toward a deeply hidden memory. He slammed his hands onto the glass table and looked at me with a wild, desperate glimmer in his eye. He yelled about his mother's personal trust. He brought up a conversation he had overheard a decade ago. He claimed he knew Evelyn had established a private, separate inheritance account specifically designated for him. He insisted that the money was supposed to be released when he turned 35 ans. He demanded that we unlock that specific trust fund to satisfy the escrow demand. He shouted that the money was his legal birthright and that Evelyn would never have allowed me to steal it from him. He ordered Desmond to execute the transfer from Evelyn's accounts immediately. I felt a cold, righteous fury solidify in my veins. My son was attempting to use his deceased mother as a financial shield. He believed he had uncovered a secret vault that would magically erase the consequences of his horrific choices. Desmond slowly closed his silver pen. He looked at Colin with an expression of profound pity. He informed Colin that he was partially correct. He confirmed that Evelyn had indeed established a legacy trust intended for her only son. He explained that the trust contained a highly diversified portfolio of blue-chip stocks and municipal bonds. Desmond revealed that the current valuation of that specific trust was just over $1.2 million. Colin's eyes widened with greedy, frantic hope. He let out a breathless laugh. He shouted that the money was enough. He demanded that Desmond draft the release authorization right now. He practically ordered us to use his mother's money to pay off the bank and drop the seed loan demand. He believed he had just won the war. Desmond did not move. He simply reached into the very back of the black folder and pulled out a final incredibly thick legal document bound with a heavy brass seal. He pushed it across the table. He told Colin that he needed to read the specific conditions of his mother's trust. Desmond explained the architecture of the trap Colin had unknowingly triggered. He stated that Evelyn was a deeply loving mother, but she was also a brilliant and cautious woman. When she established the legacy trust, she mandated that the funds could only be dispersed upon the approval of a primary trustee. That trustee was me, but she also included a strict, irrevocable morality and character clause. Colin stared at the thick document, his frantic hope rapidly dissolving into a new, creeping terror. Desmond continued, his voice echoing in the silent room. He explained that the character clause explicitly stated that if the beneficiary ever engaged in criminal conduct, financial fraud, or elder abuse against the primary trustee, the entire trust would be immediately and permanently dissolved. Desmond pointed to a specific paragraph on the third page. He informed Colin that the moment he forged my signature on the first commercial loan application 18 months ago, he legally triggered the dissolution clause. I stepped away from the door and walked back to the edge of the glass table. I looked down at my son. I told him that I discovered the forgery 6 months ago. I explained that upon discovering his betrayal, I exercised my legal duty as the primary trustee. I had permanently redirected the entire $1.2 million portfolio into the Pediatric Cancer Foundation. I told him the transfer was executed, finalized, and registered with the state. The money he thought was his secret salvation was currently funding hospital beds and research grants. Colin stared at the brass seal on the document. His mouth hung open. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. The massive estate he had banked his entire future on was a complete mirage. The millions of dollars he believed were sitting in a vault waiting for his signature did not exist. The money was locked behind a fortress of legal iron, completely inaccessible and permanently gone. He had thrown away his livelihood. He had sacrificed his marriage. He had alienated his parents and destroyed his reputation, all for an inheritance that he had legally annihilated with his own hands. The magnitude of his stupidity washed over him. He realized he was not a wealthy heir temporarily inconvenienced by a family feud. He was a destitute, bankrupt criminal staring at a 48-hour countdown to federal prison. Colin let out a sound that I had never heard before. It was a hollow, scraping wail that seemed to tear from the very bottom of his lungs. He slid out of the leather chair and fell to his knees on the carpeted floor. He clutched his stomach, rocking back and forth, weeping with an absolute catastrophic despair. He begged me to help him. He begged his dead mother to forgive him. He pleaded for a second chance that he knew would never come. I did not offer him a hand. I did not offer him a single word of comfort. I had spent 40 years giving this man everything I had, and he had used it all to forge a weapon against me. I looked at Desmond. The attorney nodded silently, packing his documents back into the leather portfolio. We had executed the demolition with absolute precision. Colin's entitlement was completely eradicated, leaving nothing but the ruins of his own horrific choices. I turned and walked out of the conference room, leaving my son on the floor to face the terrible approaching ticking of the 48-hour clock. The air in Desmond's office was perfectly regulated, but the atmosphere felt charged with a quiet, lethal electricity. It had been 48 hours since Colin collapsed on the conference room floor. The machinery of justice was grinding forward with an unstoppable mechanical precision. My phone rested on the edge of the glass table. Desmond sat across from me reading an email that had just arrived from the county courthouse. A faint smile touched his lips. It was the smile of a hunter watching his prey walk willingly into a snare. Desmond looked up and informed me that the public defender assigned to Gideon and Sylvia had just requested an urgent meeting. The county jail had not been kind to my in-laws. They were older people who had spent their entire lives hiding behind a veneer of suburban respectability. 2 nights on a thin plastic mattress surrounded by concrete and steel had completely shattered their fragile egos. They had realized that Colin was not coming to save them. They had realized that the bail money did not exist. Panic had set in, and panic always breeds betrayal. They wanted to negotiate a surrender. Desmond explained that Gideon and Sylvia were facing mandatory prison time for attempted burglary and criminal trespass. They had brought power tools to my front door. They had been caught actively destroying my property. The evidence was absolute. Their public defender knew they could not win a trial. Therefore, they were offering the only currency they had left to spend. They were offering to turn state evidence against their own son-in-law. I leaned back in my leather chair and processed the absolute moral bankruptcy of Megan's family. They had gleefully participated in the plan to steal my home when they believed there were no consequences. Now that the walls were closing in, they were desperate to throw Colin to the wolves. I told Desmond to arrange the meeting. I wanted to hear the exact price of their loyalty. We did not go to the jail. Desmond orchestrated a secure conference call with the public defender and his clients. The speakerphone sat in the center of the table. When the line connected, the sound of Sylvia's weeping filled the room. It was not the dignified weeping of a victim. It was the ugly, wet sobbing of a coward facing the consequences of her own actions. Gideon spoke next. His voice was completely stripped of the arrogant bluster he had used on my front porch. He sounded like a terrified old man begging for mercy. Gideon told Desmond that he and Sylvia had information regarding Colin's business practices. He said they knew about the forged signatures on the commercial bank loans. Gideon claimed that Colin had gotten drunk at a family dinner 3 months ago and bragged about how easy it was to replicate my handwriting. Gideon said Colin laughed about tricking the bank and securing hundreds of thousands of dollars. Sylvia chimed in through her tears. She swore that they had nothing to do with the fraud. She claimed they were simply innocent bystanders who had been manipulated by a sociopathic son-in-law. They offered to sign sworn affidavits detailing Colin's confession. They offered to testify against him in federal court. In exchange, they begged Desmond to ask the local district attorney for leniency on their burglary charges. I listened to them trade my son's freedom for a reduced sentence. It was a spectacular display of cowardice. They were actively destroying Megan's marriage to save themselves from a few years in a state facility. Desmond muted the phone and looked at me. He noted that their testimony would be incredibly useful to the federal prosecutors building the wire fraud case against Colin. It would provide direct witness corroboration of his intent to commit forgery. But Desmond also pointed out that we did not actually need their help. The digital trail and my own sworn affidavit were already more than enough to secure a federal indictment against my son. I stared at the speakerphone. A new strategy began to crystallize in my mind. Gideon and Sylvia were useless as weapons against Colin, but their betrayal was an incredibly potent weapon to use against Megan. Megan was still sitting in a holding cell. Her bail had been permanently revoked after her hysterical outburst on my driveway. She was facing a severe felony assault charge for striking me with the crystal glass. However, a trial for felony assault could drag on for months or even years. Trials were unpredictable. A sympathetic jury might look at a crying young woman and decide to lessen the charges to a simple misdemeanor. I could not allow that to happen. Megan needed to be permanently branded as a violent felon. She needed a criminal record that would follow her for the rest of her life. She needed to be locked away without the possibility of an appeal. I unmuted the phone. I spoke directly to Gideon and Sylvia. I told them that I found their offer deeply interesting. I explained that I would be willing to contact the district attorney. I would be willing to request that their felony burglary charges be reduced to simple misdemeanors resulting in probation instead of prison time. I heard them both gasp with relief. Sylvia began to thank me profusely. I cut her off. I told them my leniency came with one absolute non-negotiable condition. I demanded that their public defender immediately transmit their sworn written statements, throwing Colin under the bus to Desmond's office. I needed their betrayal documented, signed, and legally notarized. Gideon did not hesitate for a single second. He agreed immediately. He promised the documents would be sent within the hour. They hung up the phone, believing they had just won their freedom. They did not realize they had just handed me the exact tool I needed to destroy their daughter. Within 45 minutes, the fax machine in Desmond's office began to print. The pages contained the detailed sworn statements of Gideon and Sylvia Barrett. They painted Colin as a master manipulator and a confessed fraudster. They detailed his drunken bragging about stealing my identity. It was a total, comprehensive assassination of his character executed by his own in-laws. Desmond gathered the papers and placed them in a clean manila folder. He looked at me and asked what the next phase of the operation was. I told him we were going to visit the county courthouse. We were going to have a conversation with the criminal defense attorney assigned to represent Megan. The drive to the courthouse was quiet. The city moved past the tinted windows of Desmond's car, but my focus was entirely internal. I was calculating the psychological pressure points of my daughter-in-law. Megan drew her strength from her perception of superiority. She believed her parents were untouchable. She believed her husband was a wealthy mastermind. I was about to show her that her parents were cowardly rats, and her husband was a destitute criminal facing federal prison. We arrived at the courthouse and walked through the marble corridors to the public defender's wing. Megan's assigned attorney was a tired-looking woman with stacks of files covering her desk. She looked up in surprise when Desmond introduced himself as my legal counsel. She knew I was the victim in the assault case. She assumed we were there to demand the maximum possible sentence. Desmond sat across from her desk. He maintained his cold, professional demeanor. He informed the defense attorney that we were there to offer a highly unusual plea agreement. He explained that I was willing to avoid the public spectacle of a lengthy trial. I was willing to offer Megan a direct path to a resolution. Desmond laid out the terms. Megan would enter an immediate ironclad guilty plea to the charge of aggravated felony assault. She would accept a mandatory minimum sentence of 18 months in a state correctional facility. She would accept a permanent violent felony conviction on her record. She would waive all rights to a future appeal. In exchange for this unconditional surrender, I would personally contact the district attorney handling the case against her parents. I would advocate for Gideon and Sylvia to receive misdemeanor probation instead of felony prison time. Megan's attorney scoffed at the offer. She leaned back in her chair and stated that her client would never accept those terms. She claimed Megan was planning to argue self-defense. She said Megan believed she could win over a jury and walk away with a simple slap on the wrist. She told Desmond that we had no leverage to force a guilty plea for a violent felony. Desmond did not argue. He simply opened the manila folder and slid the sworn statements of Gideon and Sylvia across the desk. He invited the attorney to read what Megan's parents had just signed. The defense attorney picked up the papers. Her eyes scanned the text. The smug confidence completely drained from her face. She read how Gideon and Sylvia had entirely abandoned Colin. She read how they were offering to testify against him in federal court to save themselves. She realized instantly that the unified family front Megan was relying on did not exist. Desmond spoke quietly, but his words carried the weight of an anvil. He told the attorney that Colin was currently under federal investigation for massive wire fraud. He noted that Colin was bankrupt and facing decades in federal prison. He pointed out that Megan's parents had just signed documents proving they would betray anyone to save their own skins. Desmond explained that Megan was completely isolated. She had no money, no husband, and no family left to protect her. If she went to trial, she would be fighting alone with a public defender against a victim who had unlimited resources and flawless documentation of her unhinged behavior. Desmond tapped the sworn statements. He told the attorney to take those papers down to the holding cell. He told her to show Megan exactly what her parents had done. He gave the attorney exactly 2 hours to secure the guilty plea. If Megan refused the deal, I would ensure her parents went to prison for burglary, and I would ensure she received the absolute maximum sentence for the assault. We left the public defender's office and walked to a quiet bench near the courthouse cafeteria. We did not speak. We simply waited for the inevitable collapse. The psychological pressure placed on Megan was mathematically inescapable. She was sitting in a concrete cell, stripped of her designer clothes and her arrogant delusions. When her attorney walked in and handed her the statements signed by her own parents, the destruction of her reality would be absolute. She would read the words. She would see the signatures. She would realize that Gideon and Sylvia cared more about their own comfort than they cared about her marriage or her future. She would realize that Colin was a fraud who could not even afford to buy her a cup of coffee, let alone finance a high-powered legal defense. The isolation would crush her. The sheer terror of facing a trial completely alone, knowing her own parents were willing to turn state evidence, would break her spirit. We waited for 1 hour and 45 minutes. Megan's defense attorney walked out of the secure holding area. Her face was pale and drawn. She approached our bench holding a standardized court document. She did not look at me. She handed the paper to Desmond. It was a formal plea agreement. At the bottom of the page, written in a shaking, uneven script, was Megan's signature. She had capitulated. The realization that her parents had abandoned her and that her husband was a ruined criminal had completely shattered her will to fight. She had signed away her freedom. She had accepted the felony conviction. She had agreed to spend the next 18 months of her life wearing a state-issued uniform and sleeping on a steel cot. She had traded her future to protect the cowardly parents who had just proven they would sell her out in a heartbeat. Desmond reviewed the signature, ensuring every legal requirement was met. He nodded slowly and placed the document into his briefcase. He looked at the defense attorney and thanked her for her prompt cooperation. He assured her that he would make the necessary phone call regarding Gideon and Sylvia before the end of the day. We walked out of the courthouse and stepped into the bright afternoon sunlight. The air felt remarkably clean. The demolition of my son's entitled empire was proceeding with flawless efficiency. Megan was permanently branded as a violent felon and locked away in a cage. Her parents had humiliated themselves and fractured their own family to secure a pitiful probation. And Colin was wandering the streets of the city, completely destitute, waiting for the federal agents to arrive. I got into the passenger seat of Desmond's car. I watched the courthouse recede in the rearview mirror. I had excised the infection from my life. I had used their own greed and cowardice to engineer their total destruction. The silent reckoning had demanded absolute justice, and I had delivered it without mercy. My legacy was secure. My home was quiet. The parasites had been burned away, leaving nothing but the clean, hard truth of consequences. The deadline expired with the absolute silence of a digital clock ticking down to zero. There was no desperate last-minute wire transfer hitting Desmond's escrow account. There was no miraculous financial intervention to save Colin from the consequences of his own arrogance. Precisely at 2 p.m. on Friday, the commercial bank initiated their total liquidation protocol. Desmond had forwarded the unredacted dossier of forgery and fraud directly to their executive legal team. The bank's response was immediate and merciless. They did not merely freeze Colin's business assets, they completely cannibalized the firm. The speed of the corporate execution was breathtaking. Court-appointed liquidators descended upon Colin's leased office space before the end of the business day. They carried heavy plastic crates and locked file boxes. They seized every computer, every server, every piece of commercial inventory, and every piece of office furniture. They stripped the polished glass desks and the expensive leather chairs that Colin had purchased to project an illusion of wealth. The employees were dismissed immediately, without severance or explanation. The doors were padlocked, and a stark white legal notice was taped to the glass entrance prohibiting any unauthorized access. Colin's corporate empire, a brittle castle built entirely on the stolen foundation of my personal estate, was dismantled and erased in a single afternoon. The financial bloodletting was even more severe. The bank exercised their ultimate right of offset to reclaim the $500,000 Colin had fraudulently extracted. They drained every corporate operating account down to the last penny. When those funds proved insufficient to cover his massive liabilities, they attacked his personal assets. The joint checking accounts, the modest savings he shared with Megan, the investment portfolios he bragged about at family dinners were all seized and zeroed out. Desmond ensured that the original $150,000 seed loan I had provided 5 years ago was prioritized in the recovery hierarchy. The money was clawed back from the wreckage of Colin's life and securely deposited back into my accounts. By the time the sun set on Friday evening, Colin was not just bankrupt, he was completely destitute. On Monday morning, I decided I needed to witness the physical manifestation of his collapse. I did not want to gloat or revel in his misery. I simply needed to see the final phase of the excision with my own eyes. I drove my car to the affluent downtown neighborhood where Colin and Megan had leased their exorbitant high-rise apartment. I parked across the wide tree-lined avenue and turned off the engine. The morning air was crisp and clear, completely indifferent to the human tragedy about to unfold. A heavy industrial flatbed tow truck turned the corner and backed up toward the designated resident parking area. 2 men wearing neon utility vests stepped out holding thick clipboards and heavy steel chains. They walked directly to the pristine luxury sports utility vehicle that Colin had leased 10 months ago to project dominance and success. It was the same vehicle he had driven to my house on Easter Sunday when he demanded my surrender. The repossession agents did not hesitate. They secured the axles, attached the winch, and began dragging the heavy luxury car up the steel ramp of the flatbed truck. The grinding whine of the hydraulic winch echoed loudly across the quiet street. The noise drew Colin out of the building. He burst through the glass lobby doors wearing gray sweatpants and a wrinkled t-shirt. He looked frail and completely unraveled. He ran toward the tow truck, waving his arms frantically and shouting at the men to stop. I watched through my windshield as he pleaded with the repossession agents. He pulled out his phone and tried to show them an email. He likely begged for another 48 hours or promised them a check that he knew would bounce. The agents ignored his frantic pleas entirely. They had heard every variation of a desperate lie from 1,000 different bankrupt clients. One of the men simply handed Colin a printed legal notice of default and climbed back into the cab of the truck. Colin stood on the sidewalk barefoot and trembling, watching the flatbed truck pull away with the ultimate symbol of his fake prosperity. He looked small and utterly defeated. Sitting in the quiet isolation of my car, I watched the man on the sidewalk and felt a sudden violent shift in my memory. The gray pavement of the downtown street seemed to blur and dissolve entirely, replaced by the sun-baked asphalt of my old suburban driveway 30 years ago. I remembered a warm Saturday afternoon in late spring. The air was thick with the smell of freshly cut grass and blooming honeysuckle. I remembered standing on the driveway, holding the back of a small red bicycle. A young boy sat on the saddle, gripping the rubber handlebars with white-knuckled determination. It was Colin. He was 5 years old, wearing a bright yellow helmet and scraped denim shorts. We had just removed the training wheels. He was terrified of falling, but he trusted me implicitly. I remembered the sound of his high-pitched voice asking me if I promised not to let go. I promised him I would hold on until he found his balance. I remembered running alongside the bicycle, my hand firmly gripping the seat, guiding him down the gentle slope of the driveway. I told him to keep his eyes forward and to keep pedaling. He pedaled furiously, his small legs churning with all the strength he possessed. When I felt the bicycle stabilize and find its natural momentum, I slowly released my grip. I remembered the exact moment he realized he was riding on his own. He wobbled for a terrifying second, but then he straightened out. A sound of pure, unadulterated joy erupted from his lungs. He was flying. He reached the end of the driveway and squeezed the brakes, coming to a safe halt. He turned around, his face flushed and glowing with absolute triumph. He looked at me with eyes full of hero worship and unconditional love. In that beautiful, pristine memory, he was entirely pure. He was a boy full of potential and light. The memory faded as quickly as it had arrived, pulling me back to the cold leather interior of my car. I looked across the street at the 35-year-old man standing on the sidewalk clutching a repossession notice. I searched my heart for a spark of connection. I searched for the love I had felt for the boy on the bicycle. I searched for the protective instinct that had defined my entire adult life. I found absolutely nothing. The emotional well was completely dry. The realization was profound and terrifying in its emptiness. I mourned the 5-year-old boy in the yellow helmet. I mourned the potential he once possessed and the future we could have shared. But that boy was dead. He had been dead for a very long time. The entity standing on the sidewalk was a hollow parasite that had consumed my son and worn his face. This creature had forged my signature. This creature had conspired to declare me mentally incompetent and lock me in a medical facility. This creature had watched his wife physically assault me and then blamed me for the violence. I felt no pity for him. I felt only the cold clinical satisfaction of a surgeon who had successfully removed a malignant tumor from a vital organ. The excision was necessary for my own survival. Colin turned away from the empty street and dragged himself back into the lobby of his building. He did not know that his humiliation was only half complete. Desmond had informed me that the luxury apartment complex management had received the notification of Colin's frozen bank accounts. The management company required an automatic monthly withdrawal for the exorbitant rent. When the transaction failed the previous day, they immediately served Colin with a notice of eviction. He had exactly 3 days to vacate the premises before the county sheriff arrived to physically remove him. I did not stay to watch the final eviction. I read Desmond's detailed report the following afternoon. Colin could not afford professional movers. He could not afford a storage unit. He was forced to pack the remnants of his life into cheap black garbage bags. He dragged those bags out of the marble lobby of his high-rise under the judgmental stares of the building concierge and his wealthy former neighbors. He had managed to secure a tiny rundown apartment in a decaying industrial neighborhood on the far eastern edge of the city. The rent was paid in cash using the very last few dollars he had managed to scrounge by pawning a watch and a few pieces of electronics. It was a bleak, miserable existence. The walls of his new apartment were stained with age and the windows looked out over a landscape of abandoned factories and cracked concrete. The noise of heavy freight trucks rattled the thin glass day and night. He was completely isolated in his new squalor. Megan was sitting in a county jail waiting for her transfer to a state correctional facility to begin her 18-month sentence. Gideon and Sylvia had completely cut off all contact. They were busy cooperating with the local prosecutor, trying desperately to maintain their probation agreements and avoid prison time for their attempted burglary. They had thrown Colin to the wolves and refused to answer his calls. Colin sat alone in a dark, cramped room surrounded by black garbage bags. He had no money to turn on the utilities. He had no internet to search for a way out. He was waiting in the suffocating heat of a dying apartment for the heavy, inevitable knock on his door. He knew the federal investigators were finalizing their case. He knew the bank fraud division had handed over the forged loan applications. He was simply existing in a state of suspended terror, knowing that the final drop of the guillotine was only days away. The massive empire of entitlement he had built on my back had crumbled to dust, and he was choking on the ashes. I closed Desmond's report and deleted the file. The audit of betrayal was complete, and my ledgers were finally clean. I turned my attention away from the ruins of my son's life and walked out to my garden to enjoy the quiet, unbroken peace of the afternoon. The storm rolled in just after twilight, swallowing the suburban neighborhood in a suffocating darkness. The sky bruised into a deep, violent purple before breaking open. Rain lashed against the large bay windows of my study, driven by a bitter, relentless wind that stripped the autumn leaves from the oak trees. Inside the house, the temperature was perfectly regulated. The air smelled of old paper and the cedar logs burning quietly in the stone fireplace. I sat in my reading chair listening to the rhythmic, heavy drumming of the rain against the thick glass. It was a cleansing sound. It was the kind of rain that washes away the accumulated grime of a long, bitter season and leaves everything stark and bare. The perimeter alarm chimed softly from the security console on my desk. It was a single, discrete tone indicating a physical presence at the main automated gate. I set down my book and walked slowly over to the glowing monitors. The high-definition night vision cameras cut through the darkness and the driving rain with absolute clarity. A solitary figure was standing on the wet asphalt, gripping the slick wrought iron bars of the gate. It was Colin. He had no car parked at the curb. He had no umbrella to shield himself from the downpour. He was wearing the exact same thin gray sweatpants and wrinkled cotton shirt he had worn during his eviction 3 days ago. His expensive leather loafers were ruined, completely soaked through and caked with street mud. The heavy rain had plastered his hair flat against his skull, and his clothes clung to his violently shivering frame. He looked like a stray dog caught in a flash flood. He looked entirely pathetic. But I knew better than to open my door to a stray animal that had already proven it carried rabies. I pressed the intercom button on the console. I did not speak a word. I simply activated the two-way audio feed so I could hear the storm and whatever desperate scripted lies he had prepared for this performance. "Dad!" He yelled over the howling wind and the sound of the rain. His voice was hoarse and broken, entirely devoid of the smug corporate arrogance that usually defined him. "Dad, please. I know you are in there. I know you can see me on the security cameras. Please open the gate. It is freezing out here. I have walked for 5 miles in the dark. I have absolutely nowhere else to go." I stood up from my desk. I walked to the hallway closet and retrieved a large, heavy black umbrella. I did not put on a coat or a jacket. I stepped out the front door and walked down the long, winding driveway. The rain hammered against the taut nylon fabric of the umbrella, sounding like a swarm of angry locusts. The wet gravel crunched steadily beneath my shoes. I moved with a slow, deliberate cadence. I was not rushing to save him. I was simply walking down to the perimeter to inspect the final debris of a completely demolished structure. When I reached the gate, Colin fell to his knees on the freezing wet asphalt. His fingers wrapped around the thick iron bars, squeezing so tightly, his knuckles turned stark white. He was shivering violently, his teeth chattering audibly in the cold night air. The automated security floodlights clicked on, illuminating his face with a harsh, brilliant glare. The arrogant veneer was completely gone, leaving only a terrified, ruined shell of a man. "Dad," he sobbed heavily, water streaming down his face, mixing freely with his tears. "Thank God. Thank God you came out here. Please, just open the gate. Just let me sleep in the garage tonight. Let me sleep in the unfinished basement. I do not care how cold it is. I have lost everything." The federal agents came to my apartment today. They seized my laptop and my phone. They told me the criminal indictment is coming down next week. I do not have a lawyer. I do not have a single dollar to my name. I am so scared, Dad. I am so completely terrified. I stood exactly 2 feet away from him, separated only by the thick iron bars of the security gate. I kept the umbrella angled slightly forward to block the biting wind. I did not reach into my trouser pocket for the electronic gate remote. I looked down at him, and I simply waited in total silence. He tried to stand up, but his knees buckled, and he slumped back down against the wet, slick metal. He looked up at me through the bars, and his tone suddenly shifted. The raw, unvarnished panic morphed into something deeply familiar and intensely repulsive. It was the exact same manipulative, cloying cadence Megan had used in my dining room on Easter Sunday. It was the sound of a parasite desperately trying to mimic genuine affection to secure a new host. "You have to help me, Dad," he pleaded, his voice taking on a sickeningly sweet, whining quality that made my skin crawl. "We are family. You are my father. You are supposed to protect me when things go wrong. I know I made mistakes. I know I messed up the paperwork at the bank. But it was just business. It was just a stupid misunderstanding about the commercial collateral. You know, I never meant to actually hurt you or steal from you. I was under so much financial pressure. The economy has been terrible. And you know what Megan is like. You saw how she acted. She demanded the luxury vacations and the expensive leased cars. She made me do it to keep up appearances. I was just trying to keep my wife happy. You understand that, do you not? You loved Mom. You know what it is like to want to provide everything for your wife. He was kneeling in the pouring rain, facing a mandatory federal prison sentence for massive wire fraud and aggravated identity theft, and he was still actively trying to minimize his crimes. He was still trying to blame his incarcerated wife for his own fraudulent actions. He was still trying to weaponize my deep love for his dead mother to extract a final drop of unearned pity. The absolute moral bankruptcy of his argument was staggering. I listened to the steady, relentless drumming of the rain against the umbrella. I felt the cold, damp wind push against my clothes. But internally, I felt nothing but a profound, absolute stillness. The emotional void I had discovered while watching his luxury car being towed away was complete and permanent. There was no residual paternal guilt whispering in my ear. There was no lingering tragedy tearing at my heart. I was simply looking at a dangerous, lying criminal who had finally run out of victims to bleed dry. Colin reached his trembling hand through the gap in the iron bars, desperately reaching out to touch my leg. I took a single calm step backward, keeping myself completely out of his physical reach. "Dad, please!" he begged, his voice cracking into a shrill, desperate shriek that echoed over the storm. "Just press the button. Just open the gate. Give me a second chance to make this right. I will do anything you want. I will go to a rehabilitation clinic. I will go to psychological counseling. I will work in the garden every day and earn my keep. Just do not leave me out here in the freezing cold. Do not throw your own flesh and blood away like garbage." I looked him directly in the bloodshot, panicked eyes. I slowly reached up with my free hand and touched the thick white medical bandage secured just above my left eyebrow. The deep laceration was throbbing slightly in the damp, freezing air. It was a permanent physical reminder of his absolute betrayal. It was the undeniable mark of the violent felony assault he had orchestrated, permitted, and then tried to blame entirely on my supposed mental decline. Colin saw my fingers trace the edge of the bandage. His eyes darted away immediately, entirely unable to maintain eye contact with the physical evidence of his catastrophic failure. The pathetic whining manipulation died instantly in his throat, leaving only the sound of his ragged, shallow breathing. "You threw the glass." "Colin," I said, my voice slicing through the noise of the driving rain with cold, absolute precision. "I just let it shatter." I did not offer him another word. I did not give him the satisfaction of an argument or the dignity of a debate. I simply turned my back on him. I began the long, slow, deliberate walk back up the winding gravel driveway toward the warm, glowing lights of my home. "Dad," he screamed, the sound tearing violently through the rain and echoing off the surrounding trees. "Dad, come back here. You cannot do this. You cannot just walk away and leave me to die." I kept walking. My measured pace did not falter for a single second. My posture did not bend under the weight of his desperate cries. I reached the covered front porch and calmly shook the excess water from my black umbrella. I stepped inside the heavy oak front door and pushed it shut behind me. I turned the brass deadbolt and engaged the secondary electronic security locks with a series of loud, definitive clicks. The thick, insulated wood immediately muffled the chaotic sounds of the storm and completely erased the pathetic shrieking coming from the street. I walked back into this quiet sanctuary of my study. I sat down in my comfortable reading chair and picked up my book from the side table. I glanced at the glowing security monitors one final time. Colin was still kneeling on the wet asphalt, gripping the iron bars of the locked gate, his mouth open in a silent scream against the pouring rain. He was completely, permanently locked out of the empire he had arrogantly tried to steal. The heavy automated gates stood firm, a permanent iron barrier, between my peaceful sanctuary and his absolute ruin. The meticulous audit of his betrayal was finally complete. The structural ledgers of my life were perfectly balanced, and the toxic accounts were closed forever. I turned my attention away from the digital monitors and looked down at the crisp pages of my book, feeling the deep, restorative warmth radiating from the stone fireplace. The silent reckoning had demanded absolute justice, and I had delivered it without a shred of hesitation or mercy. The parasites had been entirely eradicated from my territory, and for the first time in a very long time, my home and my legacy were entirely my own. The morning sun crested the eastern hills, casting long golden beams across the polished hardwood floors of my home. The storm from the previous night had completely passed. It had taken its fury and its deafening noise far away, leaving behind a sky of fractured blue and a world washed entirely clean. The heavy oak trees lining the perimeter of the estate stood perfectly still. The manicured lawns were damp and vibrant. I stood in the center of the grand living room and simply listened. There was nothing to hear. For the first time in over a decade, the heavy, oppressive silence of anticipation was gone. There was no ringing telephone vibrating with another manufactured crisis. There were no demanding text messages from Colin complaining about a delayed bank transfer or an insufficient loan. There was no shrill, entitled voice echoing from the foyer, demanding my immediate attention or threatening my peace of mind. The chaotic noise of my family had been surgically excised from my life. The amputation was severe, but the healing had already begun. I walked slowly through the quiet halls of the house. My footsteps fell softly against the thick antique rugs. I traced my fingers along the smooth wooden banisters, feeling the solid, immovable strength of the architecture. Evelyn and I had built this house to be a fortress of solitude. We had spent years carefully selecting every piece of timber and every pane of glass. We wanted a sanctuary where the clamor of the outside world could not reach us. We wanted a place of absolute safety. We had never imagined that the most dangerous invaders would carry our own last name. We had never suspected that the boy we raised within these walls would grow up to view them merely as a financial asset, waiting to be liquidated. We had filled these rooms with warmth and patience and infinite forgiveness. Colin had looked at those same rooms and seen only collateral. I stepped into the formal dining room. The morning light illuminated the long mahogany table. It was the exact table where Colin and Megan had launched their final arrogant offensive on Easter Sunday. I walked around the perimeter of the table, remembering the exact positions of the players. I looked at the specific chair where Megan had sat when she demanded I sign over the deed to the estate. I looked at the precise spot on the floor where she had hurled the crystal wine glass in a fit of petulant, violent rage. The shattered pieces of crystal had been swept away long ago. The deep, jagged scratch on the floorboard had been carefully buffed and polished by the housekeeper until it was completely invisible. The room bore no physical scars from the violence of that afternoon. The infection had been completely sanitized, leaving no trace of the sickness that had once poisoned the air. I moved toward the custom-built wine cabinet resting against the far wall of the dining room. The dark oak doors opened with a smooth, silent glide. Inside the temperature-controlled environment, protected rows of carefully curated bottles. My eyes scanned the elegant paper labels until they rested on a specific dark green bottle lying horizontally in the lower rack. It was a rare imported vintage from a prestigious vineyard. It was the exact same vintage I had opened for the Easter dinner. I remembered the day I bought the wine. I had purchased a single wooden crate of that specific vintage 20 years ago, intending to open a bottle for every major milestone in Colin's life. I had opened the first bottle when he graduated from the university, believing he was stepping into a bright and honorable future. I had opened the second bottle on the day he married Megan, believing he had found a partner who would support and elevate him. I had opened the third bottle on Easter Sunday, believing we were going to share a peaceful holiday meal as a family. That was the bottle Megan had weaponized and shattered against my wall. That was the vintage that had baptized the beginning of the silent reckoning. There was one final bottle remaining in the wooden crate. I reached down and carefully extracted the heavy glass bottle. The label was pristine and untouched by the dust of the passing decades. The dark liquid inside was completely still. I carried the bottle back to the center of the mahogany dining table. I retrieved a single crystal glass from the illuminated display hutch. I did not need to set out a second glass. I did not need to ask anyone else what they wanted to drink. I did not need to navigate the treacherous waters of social obligation or familial guilt. I picked up a heavy silver corkscrew and pressed the sharp metal tip into the dead center of the cork. I twisted the handle with slow, deliberate rotations. The metal bit deep into the compressed wood, locking perfectly into place. I pulled upward with a steady fluid motion, and the cork released with a soft, satisfying sound. The rich, earthy aroma of the vintage immediately filled the quiet air of the dining room. It smelled of dark, ripe fruit and old oak and absolute finality. I lifted the heavy bottle and poured the dark, crimson liquid into the crystal glass. I watched the wine swirl and settle against the curved sides of the vessel. I filled the glass to the exact correct measure, allowing it to breathe. I set the bottle down on the polished mahogany surface. I picked up the glass by the delicate stem and held it up to the morning light. The bright sun caught the faceted edges of the crystal, casting small scattered rainbows across the beige wallpaper. I looked around the empty, quiet room. There were no ungrateful children waiting to demand their unearned inheritance. There were no vicious in-laws plotting to steal my peace or control my assets. There were no lawyers whispering threats and no police officers writing reports. The massive, complex machinery of the reckoning had fulfilled its singular purpose and powered down. The silence was absolute. Colin was gone from my life. He was currently waking up in a freezing, damp apartment with a devastating federal indictment hanging directly over his head. His fraudulent business was a liquidated memory. His stolen bank accounts were entirely empty. His luxury vehicles belonged to the bank. He was a man who had tried to build a golden empire by stealing the structural stones from his father's foundation. He had caused the entire edifice to collapse directly onto his own head. He would spend the rest of his natural life paying the terrible price for his boundless arrogance and his careless greed. Megan was gone. She was sitting in a small concrete cell wearing a rough, generic state-issued uniform. Her designer dresses and her expensive diamond jewelry were useless relics of a life she would never experience again. She had genuinely believed that intimidation and physical violence would force a grieving old man to submit to her will. She had learned the hard way that my submission was a carefully constructed mirage, and that my retaliation was absolute. She was now a convicted violent felon who would carry the heavy weight of her criminal record like an iron chain forever. Gideon and Sylvia were gone. They had retreated back into their miserable, cowardly suburban existence. They had shamelessly betrayed their own daughter to save themselves from a mandatory prison sentence. They had proven to the world that their entire family dynamic was built on a fragile, rotting foundation of selfishness and cowardice. They would live out their remaining years knowing they had sacrificed their own blood to escape the justice they so richly deserved. They would never show their faces near my property again. I stood completely alone in the center of the vast dining room. I realized in that moment that society often equates isolation with punishment or despair. People inherently believe that a man living entirely alone must be suffering from some profound tragedy or navigating a terrible, crushing grief. They are completely wrong. Isolation is not a punishment when the people you have removed were actively trying to consume you. Isolation is a fortress. It is a shield of absolute impenetrable iron that keeps the parasites at bay. I thought about the 5-year-old boy riding the small red bicycle on the driveway. I thought about the solemn promises I had made to Evelyn when we first brought him home from the hospital. I had promised to protect him and guide him and give him every possible advantage in this difficult life. I had kept every single one of those promises. I had given him my time, my money, and my unconditional support. I had fulfilled my obligations as a father with absolute unwavering dedication. It was Colin who had broken the sacred covenant, He had taken my countless sacrifices and twisted them into weapons. He had decided that my paternal love was a glaring weakness to be exploited for financial gain. He had forced my hand. He had demanded a ruthless war, and I had simply given him the exact war he requested. I had no lingering regrets. I felt no sudden pangs of sorrow or guilt. I had mourned the tragic loss of my son a very long time ago. The desperate weeping man who had shown up at my security gate in the pouring rain was nothing more than a ghost of a memory, and I do not negotiate with ghosts. I raised the crystal glass toward the empty room. The gesture was slow and deliberate. I was not toasting to a joyful victory or celebrating their utter destruction. I was simply acknowledging the profound, undeniable weight of consequence. Justice had been served cold and absolute. The complex ledgers were perfectly balanced. The massive debts were paid in full. The parasites had been eradicated, and the host had survived the infection. I brought the crystal glass to my lips and took a slow, deliberate sip of the dark crimson wine. It tasted rich and complex and completely uncontaminated. I swallowed and let the deep, familiar warmth settle comfortably into my chest. I lowered the glass and looked out the large bay windows toward the sprawling, manicured grounds of my estate. The ancient trees stood tall and resilient against the clear blue sky. The world outside was quiet and steady and enduring. I was completely alone, and for the first time in years, I was entirely safe. The story of Nolan and Colin teaches a profound lesson about the true nature of family and the devastating consequences of greed. True familial love is built on a foundation of mutual respect, honesty, and shared sacrifice. When entitlement replaces gratitude and manipulation replaces affection, the sacred bond of family is fundamentally broken. We learn that tolerating abuse in the name of blood loyalty only empowers the abuser and destroys the victim. Setting absolute boundaries and demanding accountability is not an act of cruelty, but an act of necessary self-preservation. Genuine respect cannot be forged or stolen. Subscribe to our channel and share your thoughts in the comments below, so we can continue bringing you powerful stories of justice and truth.